I can hear you fine. Yeah. Okay. We've started. Max and Stacy, thank you so much for doing this. It's a great honor to have you guys as my first guests. It was something that I really wanted to do from way out. I'm like, who's going to be my first guest? I wonder if they will be free enough to to come on board because um, from the very earliest days of this account, you two were the first of any prominent Bitcoiners to really interact with my account, to follow my account, and then boost my content when I virtually had hardly any followers at all. And that meant the world to me because I'm not getting too much engagement when I've got like 1,500 followers. And then suddenly like Max retweets or you retweet and I get 150 extra new followers like in the next few hours. Like when you're starting something out and there's so much of an unknown uncertainty and then suddenly, you get a little bit of validation like that, it means the world, right? It was so much encouragement at that early stage that fueled me to keep pushing and growing this account. So I want to thank you for your support in the early days of my account and for doing this and being my first guests as well. I really do appreciate it.
Well, we're so honored to be your first guest.
Yeah, thanks.
And I believe kind of that's what we've been doing since the very beginning. 2010 was when we first met Bitcoin. We first talked about it on international television, and I guess it was 25 cents at the time, though, of course, nobody paid attention to the price at that point. Certainly we didn't in our Keiser Report episode, which was December of 2010. And we've just been encouraging people the whole time to liberate themselves, to put themselves out there, to make their voices heard, and to be something.
Do you remember what you thought when you first came across Bitcoin? Because it's an interesting idea, and a lot of people sort of interpret it through whatever lens they're looking at the world at that time. And I remember I just looked at it as a sort of new technology, but unproven, and let's just see if it sticks around. But how did you guys think of Bitcoin at that time?
Well, it was, I'd been involved in video gaming in the 90s, and I created the Hollywood Stock Exchange in the 90s, and I invented a virtual specialist technology and currency and securities. And there were a lot of virtual currencies and gaming currencies at that time. There's a site called Second Life, which had their currency. I think it was called Lumens.
Linden Dollar.
Oh, Linden Dollars. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there was Whoopi Goldberg was promoting a currency called Beans. And so the Hollywood dollar on the Hollywood Stock Exchange was a virtual currency. And of course, when you have a virtual currency in a game, it's centralized. It's highly centralized. And my patent, of the invention that I created, it's a way for the centralized entity to control the currency in the game and everything through the back end of the admin of that. And so when I saw Bitcoin, it was like, oh my God, a virtual currency has escaped the game, right? It escaped the game and it went into the real world. And I was like, this is cool because it could take over the world. And sure enough, it has.
At that time, so the way the Keiser Report worked was that, Max is a natural on stage. I'm not a natural on stage. He's natural being on camera. I'm not natural being on camera. But I had always worked in Hollywood up until I met him, or in television at the BBC, for example, working on a lot of comedy programs there and working on scripts and, producing content with other people being on camera. And so I would always find the headlines and create the narrative. Every one of our episodes, rather than, it always had a narrative. And that's why I think it became such a global hit. And it carried, it was so good for so long, right? Because we always had a narrative through each episode and through the 3 episodes per week. And Max would always, he had a history in banking and virtual currencies and Hollywood, entrepreneur, Wall Street. So whatever headline those are the sort of headlines I would look for, mostly in central banking and gold in the very first days. And the financial collapse, the ongoing financial collapse. So I saw the first Bitcoin story and I mentioned it. I was actually in New York at the time. My mother was not well. and I was in New York, and I had seen this story, and as a kind of escape outside the financial system, because a lot of our content up until we discovered Bitcoin, but then even more so after we discovered Bitcoin, it was always about sovereignty from banks, and covering all the financial frauds and scams and derivative frauds and CDOs. We were the first to talk about all of the, collateralized debt obligations, the mortgage-backed security fraud, all of that stuff before we discovered Bitcoin and central banking fraud. So we were already, I was already inclined to find that kind of story, right? So I would scour the press online and in the real world at that time. And this Bitcoin story, I forget where the headline was from, but I found a headline about that. And just talking about it, apparently it was in Bitcoin Talk, and everybody was talking about us talking about Bitcoin, but I didn't know. We weren't that into Bitcoin. I had just covered it from a story I had read online. And it was probably in one of the tech journals. And so the Bitcoiners at the time reached out to me, right? Like, you guys talked about us. And that's when Max and I started talking about it more deeply, because at first I said to him, hey, we have a guest coming into the studio, which we were filming in Paris at that time, John Matonis. And I said, he wants to talk about Bitcoin. And, it's kind of like the Hollywood dollar. Mm-hmm. And you could see Max's discovery during the interview if you look back on it. Like, he was like, wait, this is nothing like the Hollywood dollar. This is decentralized. We were centralized, and,
Yeah, and pretty quickly we had, for example, Tour de Meester was on shortly thereafter, and we were already talking about nation-state adoption of Bitcoin back in 2014, and some other guests, and how
Amir
Taki was an early guest, and he was on a few times, and he was really a raw cypherpunk personality, and so these are folks that, of course, formed the foundation of the culture and the phenomenon of the cypherpunk movement as it became Bitcoin, and now we see what's happening today. So that was the beginnings of it. And of course, Bitcoin, as all new technologies, tend to be adopted first by the sex industry or the drug trade or gambling, right? Those vices tend to drive technology, whether it's the VCR, whether it's the internet. New technology is driven typically by vices and on the fringe of society. And that was similar with Bitcoin. And so now, of course, it's become dominated by the Wall Street crowd and institutions and nation states and sovereign wealth funds. And so that journey took about 15 years.
So, look, I've been in this space since late 2020, and I started this account early 2021. And whenever discussion about nation-state adoption comes up, there's a really strong conviction about the inevitability of that. But when you guys were talking about it back then, was it more of a hope than anything? Because Bitcoin had barely sort of taken hold. Its roots were not that deep yet. And so what was the tone of the discussion when people started talking about nation-state adoption? Because I just imagine it would have seemed so fanciful. Was it more of a theoretical discussion about if Bitcoin took off, then what would happen?
Or as Stacy has said, we were really into gold and following the gold bugs for a while, and that was a transition into Bitcoin. And of course, the gold bug space is libertarians and folks talking about central banks and the failure of central banks and the problems of central banks, and are there solutions to central banks, and Hayek and Hayek's economics and Austrian economics. Now, Austrian economics is essentially a theory that would never ever be tried in history, because as Hayek himself said, you would need some sly workaround to introduce a currency that the government was unaware that you were doing this. And that is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is that sly workaround that Hayek talked about in 1984. So we now have proof that Austrian economics and everything that comes with it, and read Safdien and Moose's books to get an in-depth look at this type of idea. We now know what happens. It's actually the Austrians were right all along, and Bitcoin proves it. And so there was always that discussion in those terms. So if a nation state adopted it, in other words, if a central bank would be disintermediated by the presence of money that was outside of the state, separating money from state. That's always been an interesting theoretical concept. And until Bitcoin, that was never possible. And now we've had this whole 15 years of it, and we're seeing it transform the idea of a nation state and a central bank, the same way that P2P file swapping transformed the music industry from centralization, monopolies, oligopolies to streaming, and to utterly transform that music industry. So Bitcoin is P2P for money, and it's having the same impact on the whole banking and central banking arena as well.
For me, it was a little. For me, it was a little bit. For me, it was a little bit different because I was finding the narrative and the stories, and at that time, I feel looking back that Bitcoin has always it was perfectly structured by and planned by Satoshi. In the early days, it was something very different, and it attracted the outlaws, essentially, the people outside the global financial system. Even our show, right? It was broadcast on international television of Russia Today. So it naturally, the people watching it, and we talk to them now, but in 2010, 2011, 2012, think about it. It was all of Latin America, parts of Asia, Africa. These people were also seeing our content first, but especially in Latin America. And, they think of if it's CNN or BBC where they're getting their news, they automatically think that's like the empire. That's like that, they don't trust it in the same way that they trusted Russia Today or Al Jazeera or other content like that from non-empire states. So it was also so easy to get. I got a lot of Bitcoin from the faucets, right? So you would get 5 Bitcoin at a time. So it was easy to say, oh, hey, here, Archie, take 5 Bitcoin. So it was so easy to get that you thought it would always be easy to get. So your whole mindset was different about it. Like your mindset shifted. Like it's so hard to even, explain to people how different it is today in 2025 versus what it was like in 2010 or 2011 in terms of who was involved. It was almost exclusively renegades, outlaws, autists, back then, the cypherpunks. And then the bankers got involved. I would say Barry Silbert was probably the biggest early banker to get involved in it, at least publicly. There were some others maybe that were, behind the scenes. But Barry Silbert was on our show. He was on the news talking about Bitcoin at a very early time. Chamath, he was another big Silicon Valley guy talking about it like in 2013. But Max was always like, again, because he was from Wall Street, right? He was a different sort of storyteller in what was possible. And I remember you could see my face and some of the reactions when I remember Max saying that Bitcoin would go to $50 billion market cap. And I remember going, oh my God, no way. And I was like, totally like, how are you saying that? That's outrageous. Right. So, those episodes still exist. They're online somewhere. I mean, our channel did get taken down from YouTube, but it had already been downloaded by everybody all over the place. And we did make a 10-part series where you see some of this. But Max and Tur Demeester, as he mentioned in 2014, Tur Demeester, again, like everybody comes from where they're at. So Tur is Belgian, but he had been living in Argentina, where we had a big following because of all the, the currency crises and financial crises, banking crises going on there. And so he saw firsthand, the sort of place that would adopt it first, the sort of need at a nation state level for Bitcoin. Even then, when, I don't know, maybe it was like $300, $400 at that time. And they did have a conversation on our show. We were in London, and they mentioned nation state adoption. And Tur and Max said, like, the first country to adopt it would be small, so they could get, there's only like a few million people to get on board, right? And it would be economic liberty would be at the heart of their policy. So before El Salvador adopted Bitcoin, President Bukele adopted a policy of economic liberty. I mean, that's what he always calls it. If you look for the hashtags from 2019, 2020, he was always talking about economic liberty. So it was actually like as they had predicted, but at that time they mentioned like Luxembourg and Panama was the only one in Latin America they had mentioned. But Panama, of course, now looking at it, what you know about Panama compared to the rest of Central America is it has a very advanced fiat banking system, unlike the other countries, right? It's very integrated into the global financial system. So of course they were going to maybe be slower than somewhere like El Salvador, which doesn't have, the same sort of robust, deep liquid capital markets.
Yeah, I wonder, like, did anybody have thoughts of perhaps somewhere like Switzerland, which had a deep history of privacy, self-sovereignty, banking secrecy, and perhaps they may have been. I would have guessed like that. It's such a natural fit for Switzerland, but they haven't. I mean, they are taking it on, but they haven't really adopted it in the way that I.
There was no need.
Yeah.
Mother necessity is the root of all invention, right? And I always compare recently, since working for a nation state and explaining to 80,000 bureaucrats, as I recently did for the civil servants, we gave a 1.5 hour lecture for them why we were a Bitcoin country and not crypto country, for example. And, if at that level, you compare the options of a country, whether or not they adopt crypto or Bitcoin. And you can compare it to Vegas and Macau, our casinos, right? They're crypto, they're the equivalent of crypto. There are no capital markets there, but there's a lot of velocity, like huge amount of transactions, lots of ringing bells and lights and, fun and entertainment and the equivalent of memes and people getting wrecked and fun, right? People having fun getting poor, right? That's exactly what's happening. And the house always wins. Meanwhile, you have the other tier, layer one monies, U.S. Treasuries, and gold. So Switzerland built a financial capital markets upon gold, and New York upon U.S. Treasuries. So they're already like the king dog, right? In that space, they already have the capital markets. They're already winning, right? So it's always, that's the classic, whether it's a company or a country, that it's hard for Kodak. Kodak didn't like they're gone, right? They had the whole photography space and now they're gone because of the iPhone. The same thing with in this analogy, it would be that Bitcoin is the iPhone to treasuries and gold, and El Salvador had the right leader at the right time to seize upon it and be the first mover.
I want to talk a little bit more about El Salvador a little later, but Trump seems to be very much in the news, as is his ongoing desire. But, there was a lot of anticipation leading up to the election, and then he was successful. Do you think he has so far delivered on the promise of his election campaign, or how would you rate him so far on his Bitcoin promises?
Well, yeah, they definitely have a commitment to Bitcoin, and elements within his government are very committed to Bitcoin, like Cynthia Lummis and maybe Ted Cruz and Matt Gaetz, maybe. But of course, there are other competing elements, and he launched his own coin, which predictably did not do well, and so there's a lot of cross currents going on there. And so I always say there's 5 stages of Bitcoin awareness. The first stage is, wow, I just discovered Bitcoin. Here's how you fix it. 2 is, oh, I love Bitcoin. Take my shitcoin. 3 is Bitcoin is a medium of exchange. 4 is Bitcoin is a store of value, and 5 is Bitcoin hyper Bitcoinization. So everyone kind of falls into one of those 5 categories. So Trump is kind of in stage 2, where it's like, I love Bitcoin, take my shitcoin, right? So he's on stage 2 of 5, and hopefully he'll get further down the road.
I kind of feel like he has exceeded my expectations, the Trump administration. And I believe that is because of Bo Hines and David Sachs. I think they did a really amazing job with that executive order. I was blown away by how well written it was, how simple, clear, and concise it was, and how very Bitcoin maximalist it was. The executive order I refer to is the establishment of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, where El Salvador, of course, was the first to ever establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But they delivered a beautiful piece of, I guess it's not legislation, but an executive order. And I was very impressed as an American. I'm very impressed and happy that my government will be accumulating. Well, they won't sell their Bitcoin that they have, and they might, who knows? Bo Hines has hinted that they might sell some gold and buy some Bitcoin, or that they certainly, according to the executive order, any of the shitcoins that the government does hold as a result of criminal investigations, that they could possibly sell those. They won't accumulate anymore, but they definitely can sell them. So they could sell those and accumulate more Bitcoin. So I was very impressed with that. And those are members of Trump's administration that he would have appointed and picked. Ted Cruz and Cynthia Lummis are elected by their, the state voters, and they have also been doing an amazing job, I believe, also.
Also, the states, a lot of states are doing really well. I think there's 9 states where they're putting Bitcoin on the state's balance sheet. So in the United States, you see this often, whether it's the marijuana, medicinal marijuana started off as a states' rights issue, is kind of working its way up to a federal level. So the states have the power to create federal policy over time as well. So there's a lot of activity on the states.
So just also going to add that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is also a Bitcoiner, and also Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who of course owns Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the, is it 20, what do they call it, primary dealer banks with the
primary dealer, yeah.
Yeah.
There's quite a few Bitcoiners now. And even I was learning, I recently met Bo Hines in Washington, D.C., and, he had run for Congress out of North Carolina, where we are right now, because we were just up in Washington, D.C., and we're on our way back to El Salvador. But he had run against another candidate who won, but they were both Bitcoiner candidates. One was from the Democrats and one from Republicans, but they were both Bitcoiners. So it is a lot of members of Congress, whether in the Senate or House of Representatives, are Bitcoiners. And a lot of the cabinet members are Bitcoiners as well. So, and I think for the United States, it's a little bit more difficult than it was for El Salvador, simply because there is, on the other side, quite a bit to lose. And that is the exorbitant privilege of having the US dollar as a world's reserve currency that you get to print easily. So it's a very delicate balance to adopt Bitcoin without, destabilizing your own exorbitant privilege of having the US dollar. So I think so far they've done a pretty good job. The executive order is very Bitcoin maximalist, but a lot of the the framing of the conversation is more as a technology and a tech play, which of course the United States is one of the number 1 tech countries in the world. So it makes sense to position it as that, rather than positioning it where most individuals out there and other nation states are kind of positioning it as an alternative to the dollar, or certainly as a global reserve currency, right? So the U.S. is framing it more as a technology and a tech play and a Silicon Valley-like thing, or Wall Street products, which, makes sense to me, because you don't want to just renounce and give up all the advantage that you have as a reserve currency with your fiat.
One of the things that came out of the administration during that period where they were announcing the executive order was they would look into acquiring Bitcoin in a budget neutral way. And since then, And in addition to that, there was a 90-day order. Go off and study all the ways that we can do this and come back to me in 90 days. But since then, we've been hearing a very strong message from the administration about acquiring as much as possible. Have you guys speculated on perhaps some innovative budget neutral ways to
Well,
acquire as much Bitcoin as possible?
I had just mentioned one that Bo Hines was recently interviewed by Anthony Pompliano, and he mentioned that they could possibly sell some of the gold. So the United States has theoretically, of course, it hasn't been audited since the 1950s or 60s, but we do have a lot of gold, and it is valued on our balance sheet, our national balance sheet, at $35 an ounce. So obviously now it's over.
Now it's like 3,300.
Which is remarkable. I mean, that happened. It's interesting how that happened because the last I looked, it was 2,000 and now it's 3,300. And that's a classic genuine bull market where nobody even notices it, right? And we had looked at the gold markets. We were aficionados of the gold market for a long time. So the fact that we totally missed it and hadn't seen that is crazy. Like the last I saw it was like 2,200. And now it's 3,300. So anyway, we could revalue it at 3,300 and sell some of it at the market rate and buy some Bitcoin, accumulate some Bitcoin. I think theoretically we have 9,000 tons. We'll see.
Yeah, that would be a good way to get a lot of Bitcoin for sure. And definitely Bitcoin is demonetizing gold, can say. So it's a good move.
And Bit bonds is another idea that the Bitcoin Policy Institute presented, and many are championing. I think Senator Lummis has latched onto that idea. I know the guys at Van Eck, they're always out there pushing that as well. So there are a lot of the vibe in Washington, D.C., by the way. I mean, okay, Max and I have been Bitcoiners since 2010. We have been working for El Salvador, working for Bitcoin country for almost 4 years now. And wow, the vibe is just totally different, right? It's a booming town. DC, if you go there now, it's like filled with Bitcoiners. There's Pub Key is opening there. There are all these Bitcoin events there. It was like a ghost town for the last 15 years in terms of any sort of Bitcoin, anything. Nothing Bitcoin was there. In fact, if anything, you would want to avoid it and make sure not to go there so that you don't get arrested or something. But if the vibe that's happening in DC is anything to go by, I think the next 4 years are going to be pretty remarkable in the United States in terms of Bitcoin policy.
The Democrats had such a hostile attitude towards Bitcoin and the broader cryptocurrency industry, and it never really made any sense to me about why they took such an antagonizing position from the get-go. And it was really a full court press. They used every available means to try to shut down the industry. And to this day, I just don't understand to what benefit. Could you guys make any sense out of that?
Yep.
Sure. Well, left-wing policies tend to be run on government programs that are funded by printing money. So if you have money that's outside of their control, they cannot fund these government programs, and therefore they lose power. And it's come out, I think we can say with a lot of, surety that a lot of the things going on with the Democrats in terms of just sending out checks, buying votes, and buying programs, it's all with printed money. So once you take away the money printer, you can't do any of that stuff. So I can understand why they would be fearful of Bitcoin.
I also think, 2010, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, it was very, well, Ross Ulbricht is out now, right? And he's Dread Pirate Roberts, and he's going to be speaking at Bitcoin 2025. Now, he was very libertarian, all his writings. There were a lot of libertarians involved in early Bitcoin as percentage-wise. Now there's a huge tent with so many different voices inside Bitcoin. But back then there was a high concentration of libertarians and tech bros, you know, all the coders and the core devs, and a lot of them maybe didn't have like normal social graces and know how to interact.
They still don't.
Yeah. So I think just the sort of people involved, and you know how the Democrats are very you know, DEI and gender based. So you know, it would be like there are no women in Bitcoin, even though I can't find, there's no other person on earth but Stacy, who I mentioned Bitcoin first on global television and global news in 2010. So I don't know anybody earlier than I was to mention it. But I think there's some of that. And then in terms of the Democratic politicians, Elizabeth Warren has a lot of voice and a lot of power and influence within Democratic, the legislature. So I think her voice was unfortunate for Democrats, that they missed an opportunity because she was seen as having influence and power. And so they followed her, right? And so she was, you know, she had started out in 2008 and 2009 having such a voice because she was like very, you know, with the Occupy Wall Street and against the, you know, all the fraud in the banks. But then she quickly got she basically worked for the big banks then. You know, she was doing everything to help the big banks. So she was the one that was against any competition to banks, but also, you know, this notion that Bitcoin mining was somehow environmentally unsound, even though like at the point she was saying that it was, most of the mining was done out of China with excess hydro, right? So, and by the way, stolen excess hydro. So nobody was paying for that. And in Texas, you know, Texas has an abundance of energy, but she, you know, the politics, the domestic politics of the U.S., of course, is Massachusetts is against Texas, right? That, you know, there are different lifestyles and different sort of, you know, Massachusetts is like the epitome of the printing money to, you know, help everybody do whatever they want, free education, free sex changes, free everything, right, for life. And Texas is the total opposite of that. So I think there's some of that. We'll see.
Yeah, there's always a classic divide between the free market on the right and the state-run government models on the left. And the state-run government models, they love issuing papers and issuing theoretical academic studies, and they love Keynesianism, and they come out of the university system where they're academics, and then they transition to government studying economic academia, and they have theories about what's fair and what is equitable, and then they use the power of the state to impose these theories. And of course, that never works. It never has worked ever in the history of the world, that governance model such as that. And it always ends up going back to market-driven economies. And we mentioned gold earlier, and as you know, these central banks are having trouble around the world and economies are having difficulty around the world. Of course, gold is responding because gold is pure price signal in a global economy. And it always comes back to gold. We never went off a gold standard. Central banks always settle in gold, has been doing that for decades. And now that they look like we're heading to a Bretton Woods 2.0, where everyone has to get together and reconfigure the global matrix of trade again, they're going to feature gold. That's how they'll start. But they probably will start with gold and end with Bitcoin. You know, I remember people saying, well, World War I started on horseback and ended with airplanes. World War II started with airplanes and ended with atomic bombs, right? World War, trade war, World War Bitcoin of the 21st century will start with gold and it'll end with Bitcoin.
And I also want to say one more thing about the United States and, you know, the Democrats. The Democrats were in power from basically 2008 until, you know, there was a brief interlude with Trump in his more chaotic, I'd say, first term. This second term, the second time around, he has like an A team. The first time he didn't, right? He had basically the deep state working with him. But until recently, until at least 2017, there were no powerful constituents in the United States. Everything in the United States is big money, big donations to political campaigns, lobbying. Like, you don't have anything like that in Europe or anywhere else in the world. So from 2017, Silicon Valley really got involved in crypto, not Bitcoin, crypto. So they started to build a powerful constituency who was interested in crypto. They're the ones that were the loudest about choke point 2.0 and choke point, all the, getting cut off from banking services, from 2020, 2021, especially during the Biden administration. And on top of that, the other thing that happened then, most importantly, I think why you see what you do right now in the Trump administration is not Silicon Valley, it is Wall Street. Wall Street launched the Bitcoin ETF, and that was the most successful financial product in Wall Street history to be launched. So success, they found a way to, make an industry around Bitcoin that they weren't early adopters. Wall Street were not early adopters, but by issuing these financial products, these ETFs, they became a powerful voice and a powerful player within the Bitcoin ecosystem. So Wall Street is the most powerful, right, in the United States. So suddenly you had Larry Fink on the news every day talking about Bitcoin, and that changed the perception so much with powerful people like the politicians, senators, and cabinet members. It was no longer considered, dodgy like in the 2013, 14, 15, when a lot of Bitcoiners are getting arrested because of, anti-money laundering, that they hadn't got their, money transmitter licenses or, they had built Silk Road or anything like that. So it suddenly had become Wall Street approved. And so I think that it created a powerful constituency. You want money. If you're running a campaign, you need Wall Street to donate to it. And so Wall Street wants you to not, stop their cash cow, which is issuing these ETFs.
I think Wall Street is well and truly embracing Bitcoin now, but I guess there's still a lingering risk in my mind about what happens in the next term. So we've got another 3.5, 3.75 years of Trump, and I expect that to continue favorably. What is the risk that the Democrats come in and continue their hostility? Have they done an internal review that says we got this wrong, or do you see some kind of change sweeping through that party? I haven't seen any signals of that, and so I'm still a little bit worried about what their position is going to be. Did they come back with a vengeance and say, "Haha, you guys helped Trump get elected, and now it's our turn to take vengeance"?
Well, Bitcoin is a movable feast, right? And you can memorize your seed phrase and go anywhere you want in the world. So if the conditions change in the United States, then Bitcoiners can leave and go somewhere else. And it's an open market. It's a free market. It's the first time you've separated money from state. That's never, ever happened before in the history of humans. And that means that you've got a monopsony, which is power of the consumer, essentially. So it goes from a monopoly power to a monopsony power, where it's a boycott. For example, a boycott is a monopsony. The boycotters are forcing change on a company by not buying the product. That's called a monopsony. With Bitcoin, you have a monopsony of money. The Bitcoiners and the private keys can simply leave and go somewhere else and do what they want. So I think the state, and I say the following, and I've said this for a long time now: money existed before the state. Bitcoin separates money from state. Bitcoin kills the state. So I think the state, along with the central bank model, is fading into history.
So sorry, go on, Stacy.
I would also say that the Democrats in 4 years, how old will Liz Warren be? How old will Nancy Pelosi be? I mean, Nancy Pelosi's, well, maybe she's up for re-election in the next congressional in 2026, which I think she's running for. but she said she's running again, but she's like 85, 86. So at a certain point, the Democrats will, eventually die out. They're grasping onto power, and they'll hold on to power until they die in office, like Dianne Feinstein. But I think eventually they're just getting at the end. Whether it's 4 or 8 years from now, they can't live that much longer. They're not going to be into office at 105 years old, right? Maybe some of them might live to 105, but at a certain point, they'll die off. Whereas the Republicans have a whole new, a whole bunch of young people, right? Relatively young. So they're all in their, like JD Vance is in his early 40s, maybe 40. So he's, they have a younger crew who are more Bitcoin native, whereas the Democrats, other than AOC, who, I don't know if they're, even those young ones are just still stuck on the the transgender issue, which I think they'll be too busy to even notice Bitcoin.
It's really strange to me that they're so attached to achieving social justice, and some of the principles are are worthwhile, but they've completely overlooked financial repression, and only to the extent that they want to direct the state and Wall Street to just open up the books or just give free things away.
Yeah,
that's the extent to which they stop. But they haven't actually looked at what about a savings mechanism for just everybody else, because not everybody has enough to be able to afford a deposit on a house. That's such a huge barrier, because housing has been a pretty good savings mechanism for a lot of people, but only if you could afford a deposit in the first place and then qualify for a loan. And all the hoops and hurdles that banks put in front of people in order to be able to achieve that. So I'm just stunned at the narrow-mindedness of the Democratic Party, and I'm really hoping, I don't want this to be like a party political tirade, I'm hoping that they come around. What I want them to do is embrace Bitcoin so that it doesn't actually become an issue, and we just have bipartisan support in the States.
It's also proof of stake mindset and maybe a guilt mindset. I'm not sure, because if you look at the voting tallies at the percentage, like the college educated, mostly white people vote Democrat, right? And I think they're the ones that think the printing press is they feel benevolent that here I'm going to print all this money and give it to you. And they think they feel good about themselves. They can't put themselves in the boots of the person that doesn't want a handout. They want a job. They want a purpose. They want a meaning in life. They want a legacy. They're like the Karen class of well, I gave you this free money and just be quiet, shut up, and just feel good about me. And it's no, I want some bigger purpose in life than just receiving handouts from you, AOC, right? So I think it's a proof of stake mindset. They have used the printing press to make themselves feel better. And they think they're better because they're not doing it just to enrich themselves in terms of, directly through finance. But they are as well, as you mentioned, housing, right? Those people all own assets. They own stock portfolios that they're allowed to insider trade on in Congress. They own the most expensive property markets in the United States are all around DC and New York, right? So that's where they own the properties, and they're raking in by printing up money to hand to people to not question, to not want more in life. They're making more money for every $1,000 they send to Joe Bag of Donuts in the flyover states. They're making 10,000 on property gains or portfolio gains. So it's easy for them to feel smug and good about themselves in the sort of setup of of a fiat money system where they get to print without any, no matter how much they print, they always win more than everybody else.
Yeah, I was just
That's a
thinking
really
about
sorry.
this.
Go on, Max. You go on.
I was just kind of thinking, I believe, if I'm not wrong, that during Jimmy Carter administration, going back to the 70s, I believe he started the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority. And the idea was, well, we're going to subsidize housing. And of course, that jacked up prices and made it unaffordable. So the solution was, again, free money. Same thing with student loans and Sallie Mae. Okay, we're going to subsidize student loans, we're going to subsidize, and it just jacked up prices and made Ivy League education unaffordable. Then under Clinton, I believe, is when they started the liar loans. So they went all these financial institutions who said, well, we'll lend money for mortgages to anybody. Just, again, free printing, money printing. Then, of course, they all got bailed out, which was more money printing, right? So there's never been an attempt to solve a problem without printing more money. That's pretty much the history since 1971, when Nixon, closed the gold window. That's what we've had. That's the only solution that's always been up. Now, we live in an interesting period now with Trump. He's come up with something new. He's using the tariff solution, right? They're just not going to blatantly print money. That's his idea, is tariffs. But I have a feeling that before long, it'll go right back to money printing.
Yeah, I get the sense. I want to make the point about, real estate and Bitcoin are often compared as investment propositions. And the difference is quite stark, only in the sense, even in the sense that the financing options available for someone with a lot of money compared to someone who's only just got enough money are really quite different. Not only do you have to pay more if you've got less money, but you also end up buying property that's actually not as valuable, and the quality aspect in terms of ongoing demand is much less. You have to buy in, less desirable areas that don't tend to go up in value by as much as in areas that are higher in demand. So our Bitcoin is all the same. It doesn't matter that Max is an OG and Stacy is an OG, and it doesn't matter how much of it you have. Someone's 0.01 Bitcoin is as valuable and is as high quality as your stack that you accumulated over the years. And with real estate, that's just not the case. The growth of your Bitcoin in price is the same as mine. But in real estate, it's not the case. If you buy a terrible house that you can barely afford out in the suburbs, compared to someone who buys premium real estate property closer to the city centers or some desirable area to live, that's obviously going to compound in price accumulation, appreciation so much more than some outward backyard or backward suburbs. So, for example, Bitcoin does not do that. We're all the same under Bitcoin. Our Bitcoin is the same price on the spot market as anybody else's Bitcoin. And so when Michael Saylor goes and does his work, that's fantastic work, spruiking the benefits of Bitcoin to Wall Street, to various investors, we all benefit from that regardless of how much we hold. With real estate, it's not the case at all. Some people benefit more
Plus,
than
in
others.
real estate, think about how corrupt it is in terms of it's the bank gives you a loan, but they send an adjuster out there, like somebody to look at the house and say what it's worth, and the same thing on a global scale. By the way, if you look at poor countries, and if you look at El Salvador. We have friends there in El Salvador who are top credit rating, your personal credit rating. And yet they're borrowing at interest rates, the same dollars, by the way, it's a dollar system there, at a much higher rate than a low credit rated person in the United States. So you have like the credit rating agencies in an individual level and a nation state level and a product level, they turned what you're talking about, the poor people the poorer people who are stuck in low grade housing where the prices don't rise until, of course, when Bitcoin came along, 2006, 7, and 8, like the lead up to that. Wall Street found a way to make a huge amount of money on those, like crappy houses with liar loans of people who would never be able to monetize that value. But Wall Street figured it out. Why? Because they had the credit rating agencies blessed it and said, yes, okay, they're worth, that $100,000 mortgage, you have like 10 of them, and we're going to make them worth like $20 million because of like, we gave it a AAA rating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to invest in an asset that treats us all equally. It's really been a blessing from God, really, because when I was having a look, I saved up quite a bit of money to buy a house, and I was just waiting for prices to become reasonable, not cheap, just reasonable. And I just couldn't put two and two together. What's going on? Why are these prices just so persistently high, even through recessions, through crashes? They dip momentarily, but you can barely conduct a house search in the neighborhood that you want in 3 or 4 months, let alone 6 months. And most dips don't even last that long. It was only when I got into Bitcoin that I made sense of it all, because despite having a business degree with a major in finance, we weren't actually taught how the system really works. We were still taught that, oh yeah, banks are intermediaries between savers and borrowers, and well, I've found out that that's not actually how it works. It's all printer goes brrr, and that's what's propping up the market.
You're describing proof of stake versus proof of work as well, right? So the housing market in the UK, I lived there for a while, and it opened my eyes because I am Gen X and I ride there, and there's like all these boomer friends of mine who I never saw actually work a day ever in the like 15 years I lived there. But they went on vacation, they had houses, like several houses. And the thing is, the boomers in the United States through the GI Bill and the huge expansion of all the suburbs in the United States through the U.S. government, like they were given in the UK, of course, Thatcher handed them all the public housing for free, basically. And they use that as collateral for their forever rolling over the debt. And the interest rates were declining for 40 years for them. As it was a slow death of fiat, of course, but they were like gaining assets, accumulating assets at the expense of the next generation with that. But that
If
was
I can
proof of
just add a
stake.
little bit of context for people listening, they may not understand the reference about giving away free housing. In the United Kingdom, historically, since World War II, they've had a lot of public housing provided to the population. And Margaret Thatcher introduced a right to buy program that gave people, if they were resident in public housing for X number of years, the right to buy it at a particular price. And I'm not exactly sure, but they may have even helped with the financing as such. And so suddenly, the public housing is spread quite evenly throughout all of London. So you could just as well have had a place in Notting Hill or Chelsea in Kensington that was provided by the state as public housing as you could have in some lower income, less desirable area. It was really a bit of a lottery where you ended up, but if you did end up in some of those nicer neighborhoods, or you ended up in a neighborhood that gentrified and became more expensive, then it was almost like winning the lottery. And so for a lot of these people, they use that as a basis or a foundation for their wealth to then further invest in more real estate. Because, of course, in the mid to late 90s, there was a massive property boom together with the resurgence of the City of London as a financial central hub or global hub. And then that sort of developed a lot of prosperity for a lot of people who would otherwise not have had access to that. And so when Stacy says free money, that's essentially what a whole generation of people who lucked out, or I'm not sure if I'm using that correctly.
It is luck.
They got lucky. They got lucky. And then many of them then moved to coastal Spain and retired there, and then voted for Brexit.
No, they didn't gain it through proof of work, right? It was just
Yeah.
total random proof luck based on the government decreeing that whoever you're going to be lucky today. You can buy this property. You have a right to buy it for £20,000, even though
Yeah,
the market
that's
says
the
it's
key.
£200,000.
Yeah.
Like they could literally flip it the next day. They could buy it from the government for £20,000 and sell it on the market for 200,000, or
Yeah, they didn't buy it
borrow
at market.
against it.
They didn't buy it at market prices. So perhaps some people are asking, well, so what? They bought it and the government
No.
financed it. No, they did not buy it at market prices. It was essentially a gift to anybody who was in public housing long enough.
Yeah, and
And then
similarly
accrued the right to buy the property.
in the 70s, they had the savings and loan crisis, and where all these savings and loan went bust because they abused the government guarantees, and then they created the trust where they dumped all these assets into the trust, and then a lot of the corporate raiders of the 1980s got started because they were buying assets from the government at pennies on the dollar, and that was the beginning of the corporate raider era on Wall Street in the 1980s because they were financed by like acquiring massive amounts of heavily discounted assets from the federal government, who had set up a bailout facility to take care of all these savings and loans that had been run to the ground by corrupt CEOs.
Do you think what happened post 2008 crisis was essentially the same thing, where there was a whole bunch of money injected into the economy, but straight into the hands of all of these hedge funds and private equity firms that bought hundreds and hundreds of thousands of family homes at rock bottom prices, essentially locking people out of neighborhoods and suburbs where they would otherwise choose to live, where the schools are, where all the public infrastructure is, family infrastructure. And so essentially we had, in the space of how many years between the savings and loans crisis and 2008?
That was the savings loan was under Reagan, right? So 80s. It started in the 70s, but they all collapsed under Reagan, and they all needed a bailout. Some of the Bush family, of
The
course.
Keating Five,
Keating
Charles
Five.
Keating.
Yeah.
And then, the 2008 crisis. So here's the thing about it, it comes up all the time, is that the number eventually that they chose, remember they were in Congress testifying, and Timothy Geithner was saying, we need $800 billion from you guys to bail out the situation. And Congress said, well, you got to come back to us with something more than just a slip of paper. Like, we need some analysis on this. And then the stock market crashed the next day, and Congress said, okay, we give in. We'll give you the money. And they wrote him this big fat check for $800 billion for all these lending facilities like TARP and others. And we added it all up. It worked out to some multi-trillion-dollar number that the federal government printed up. And here's the amazing thing about it, is that Obama, who was transitioning to become president at that time, could have very easily done something that historically would have been the norm. He could have taken that same amount of money that eventually was printed to bail out the situation and made every mortgage in America whole and every credit card debt in America whole. So everyone with a mortgage would be whole, everyone with a credit card debt would be whole, and we would start the economy all over again with everyone having been fully paid off.
And banks would not have had mortgages on their books that were underwater. That's the key.
But instead, he took that same amount of money and he gave it to the banks to make them whole. He bailed out the creditors and not the debtors, even though the creditors made those loans on the basis that they were accepting the risk of making those loans. And so he bailed out the creditors. And that historically never, ever happens. If you go back even to the Bible, they have the debt jubilee, right? The debtors get bailed out, not the creditors. The creditors are taking the risk to begin with. And if they lose money, then they understand that from day one. But their decision was made to bail out the creditors. So the creditors got to be made whole. And what did they do? They did the exact same thing from 2008 to recently, where they just ratcheted up the leverage in the economy to 10 times greater than it was in 2008. And now we have the global financial crisis that we do now. It had the seeds in 2008 and the failure to bail out the debtors in favor of bailing out the creditors, a pure gift to Wall Street, thanks to the Obama administration.
So that's really interesting, because I remember that moment really quite clearly, and the discussion that was barely had was about moral hazard of bailing out individuals, American citizens, but there was no discussion about the moral hazard of bailing out banks and financial institutions who had the expertise and the responsibility for managing their own risk. So
Right,
everybody,
another Democrat, Obama.
yes,
The solution was
everybody who
print
took
more
out a
money.
loan,
Print more money.
they ate their own cooking, right? They lost their homes. Everybody who was underwater in their mortgage, they couldn't maintain their payments. And sometimes even if they did maintain their payments, they had their homes taken away from them because of the loan to value ratio was changed as prices went down. So, you have people who are subjected to a moral hazard standard, but institutions, banks are never subjected to the same standard. And I wonder, the reason why I love talking to you guys is you're clearly Americans and proud Americans, but you've also got the global sensitivity. You guys have been around, you've lived all over the place, especially where I am right now. And so I wonder, is this a cultural thing in America where institutions are kind of looked at as something to protect, whereas people have to live up to a different standard?
Well, yeah, they changed the definition, right, during 2008 financial crisis. Globally systemic banking, financial institution, GSFI. So any of these globally systemic, globally important financial institution, they must be bailed out, right? So they're always going to be bailed out. You're never going to be bailed out. Even look at what's happening now in the United States, which we predicted back in 2020, is when they shut down the global economy during COVID, our banker was like telling us, hey, you guys should send us a document saying you can have $2 million from this PPP loan. And I was like, $2 million loan? We don't have any credit card debt. We don't have debt. I was like, I don't want a loan. I don't want to owe money. And he goes, no. It's forgivable loan. I was like, what does that even mean? What's a forgivable loan? It sounded like one of those Nigerian prince scam emails, right? No, you don't have to pay it back. It's $2 million and you don't have to pay it back. I was like, oh, okay. Well, send it. So she sent me the thing I would have to sign, the contract. And literally the first page is just a few words. And it says, if you accept this loan and you agree to this loan, you are saying that you need this loan. And if you did not receive this PPP loan, that you would go bankrupt. You would go out of business. And it's a felony. I was like, well, I'm not going to sign that, because we wouldn't go bankrupt and we wouldn't go out of business. So I'm not going to sign this because I don't want to get sued. And he goes, no, everybody's taking it. And of course now everybody, the FBI is actually going more and more after all the people that took these PPP loans and didn't actually need it. So again, they're going after individuals who took it, not the big corporations that got handed, billions and billions of dollars without question. Same with people who were sent these free loans, these forgivable loans, and now they're being arrested because they didn't read the small print.
So in the UK, we've had friends of government ministers start up during COVID. Start up new companies or revive dormant companies, no history of operation, no such expertise, no employees on the books, be awarded tens of millions of dollars in government contracts to provide, all that sort of personal protective gear for hospitals and everything else, like masks and gloves and things like that. That, as it turns out, most of them, if they were delivered, they were not fit for purpose or they were never delivered. And so some very high profile business people and politicians and friends of politicians who have come under scrutiny since then as well. So it's not.
Well, you guys aren't American. You said, is it a uniquely American phenomenon? So obviously the UK, you just described a situation. I'll give you a few more. Argentina under Milei was involved in a massive Ponzi scheme economics similar to what we're talking about here. Iceland during the Icelandic collapse of 2008, Ireland during the Celtic Tiger collapse, roughly the same period. So, and France, pre-Revolutionary War with John Law, who introduced a similar pyramid scheme and multi-level marketing Ponzi scheme. So this is not unique to American culture. It's unique to fiat money culture. Anytime you have fiat money in a central bank and give the ability to print fiat money to a few individuals, they will concoct a multi-level pyramid Ponzi scheme to replicate again and again and again the exact same fraud that we're talking about. No matter what the country is and no matter what the period is, you'll always see this always happen because that's human nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, read The Law by Bastiat, Frederick Bastiat. Right, that's the foundation of law. Is the fact that when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in a society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that justifies it and a moral system that glorifies it. Right, and he said that the nature of man. He said he's not being like harsh on anybody, but he just looks at history, and the history proves without a doubt that where it's easier to just steal, people will plunder. They'll take it, right? And fiat is like that. Fiat is easier to steal, especially if you are closer to the money printer, that the Cantillon effect. You're going to create a global legal system, a global framework, a global system whereby it's going to justify your money printing and you being closer to it and all your friends being closer to the money printer. You guys are the good guys, and you're just trying to help everybody else with all these PPP loans and all this sort of stuff. We're helping you. I can't help it that I'm so smart and I'm so powerful and I'm so brilliant that I somehow make 10 times more than you every time I print, and a moral code that justifies it, right? So the way Bastiat said you have to get around that. The only way to get around this, the human nature to plunder, to take what somebody else has done the hard work for, is that you have to make the cost higher. You have to make the cost of plunder higher than the cost of working. And that's what proof of work does, right? That's what it does. It's cheaper, it's easier to just build something and to do an honest day's labor than if you're the sort of person that is just waiting for the printer. You're going to end up poor. You're going to end up starving, and there's no printer coming for you.
Yeah, there's no substitute for work, I think. We spoke about Trump and someone else, one of our other favorite guys, the favorite guy. He's also in the news with Trump, President Bukele visiting Donald Trump. You have anything to share on that?
Well, first of all, on the subject of President Bukele and this discussion, he says that when he started his war on gangs, the major bankers around the world were telling him, be careful, because if you get rid of the gangs, your economy will suffer, because most of your economy is driven by gangs. And all the gangs that do all the looting and all the crime, they have families and they're buying stuff for their families, and it's a major component of your GDP. So he has warned against doing it too, don't be too aggressive in getting rid of all these gangs because you're going to hurt your economy. And they predicted that if he went ahead and cracked down on gangs, their GDP would collapse and they'd have several years of negative growth. But in fact, amazingly, his GDP went up. And of course, they're enjoying a peace dividend that's incredible and enormous.
It has been incredible. Like when I visited El Salvador almost 3 years ago. Well, time flies, but when I told some people that I was going there, you can imagine the reaction. You've probably heard it many, many times. It's like, you shouldn't be going there. It's not safe. It's all the statistics about crime and murder capital of this and that. And I had the most amazing experience. We did some Spaces interviews when I came back. I think we did a couple of those, and yeah. I'm sure they're still on YouTube. And my joy was palpable. The sense of excitement and the enjoyment that I had in El Salvador, staying at El Zonde Beach, was just incredible. And it wasn't fake. It was absolutely real. I felt it. I was there on the ground, and notwithstanding that, this is a country that's getting up off its feet, it was absolutely palpable in the air that there was a sense of optimism about what the future would hold. And this is not some. I felt quite protective of that when people would be sort of speaking cynically or skeptically about El Salvador at the time. And I said, no, this is something that I felt. I went there and I looked around. I saw what the people were doing and how they were enjoying themselves, and the progress as well. And so this was only less than a year since Bukele cleaned up the gang problem. And so in that time, I did not feel at all, even a moment's hesitation or doubt about my safety whatsoever. And these are streets that we're walking through, the back streets to our hotel, that were not properly lit. These are some of the really quick wins that I hope to talk about after this. But and we didn't feel unsafe at all. In fact, we felt welcomed everywhere. People would greet us often with English at a minimum, and so we didn't sense any of that at all. So I remember having that discussion with you at the time, Stacy, and I said, there's a lot of skepticism around and some critiques about putting so many people in jail in this manner. And you said, yeah, but look at how many people have been freed. Mm-hmm. And so can you just tell us a little bit about that, about what life was like before the gangs were actually swept into jail? Because it sounded like hell to me.
Yeah, and to be clear, we were living in San Benito, and you were in the San Benito area, which is the rich area, right? So it's always had a little bit more freedom to walk around and do things. The biggest change is from the areas that were literally occupied by the gangs, right? You couldn't get in or out of, like, the most densely populated area of all of El Salvador is Soyapango, which is, just outside of, it's part of San Salvador, but it's, you couldn't get in or out of there without paying, stopping at a checkpoint and giving your money basically to the gangs. Many of my students at the Cuba Plus programs are from Soyapango. There are also areas like Apopa or Ilopango in San Salvador as well, which were occupied by gangs. Apopa was considered one of the most dangerous areas in all of the world. And when the first 7 months we lived in El Salvador, we stayed at the El Bongo Style Hotel, and it only has like 6 or 7 rooms. And the waiter, Gustavo, the bartender at night, all the waiters, there were like, say 8 or 9 every night. Almost all of them were from Soyapango. And we saw the liberation through them, through their eyes, because we were well off. We were gringos, like living in a hotel in San Benito. And the global press in the U.S. were saying like very negative things about the gang war. But we would see every day them coming in as more and more of the gang members of Soyapango were arrested. Like, we asked them what they thought. And I remember Gustavo, he doesn't work there anymore, but he's like, 22 years old, 23 years old. And I remember him coming in one day and saying, you know what? I didn't have to pay any money last night. After he came off work, he would take the bus home to Soyapango. And he said there would always be a gang member there at the bus stop that he had to give money to. So his face it's not just, it wasn't the money, because it was often, like he would say, like $1 they would take from him. It's control and ownership and humiliation, right? Here's a young man, a very handsome young guy, who had to endure humiliation every single night. Like, he was going to work, doing his work, doing a hard job, But at the end of the day, he had to go home and be humiliated. There's nothing you can do. You're never going to be free. You can never do anything. You can never achieve anything, because at the end of the day, you have to come through me, the gang member, who's going to take whatever I want. Today, I'm going to take $1. Tomorrow, I might take $10. Who knows? Like, I'll take whatever you have. And by the way, when they arrested some of those gang members, you see the photos. If you look back to the photos, some of them had like, they would show photos of the piles of money that they had in their houses. They had like pennies and nickels and dimes. I mean, they were humiliating people. They were taking their last penny. It wasn't like they were brutal. They were after subjugation and humiliation. So we saw through the eyes of the waiters at the hotel we were staying at, and it was small, so we knew them very well. We talked to them all day long. We saw the transformation through their eyes. And then once, we went into Soyapango, Ilopango, and Apopa on our own, like we went there to hand out Bitcoin to people that were liberated from the gangs. And we did that in like May of 2022. So it was very early. It say maybe 30,000 of the 70,000 gang members had been arrested. So half of them were still out there. But like we were able to drive in without being stopped. We were able to, meet hundreds of people would show up to, get some Bitcoin. And I mean, we weren't just giving like $5 of Bitcoin. We were giving like $500, $1,000, $2,000 worth of Bitcoin to these small businesses and anybody who came up, really. But we saw their liberation. We saw it for ourselves, that, they had been freed. It took another year, I would say, or year and a half for them to totally believe and to forget that, the humiliation, the ritual humiliation and fear, to believe that this is over for real, and that, that 40 years of dark times is over, and that we can now start building and doing things. So there was like it wasn't like it was overnight that they were liberated almost. It was like within a few weeks, but it took them a year because of, I guess, previous governments had done deals with gangs in the past, and then arrested a whole bunch of them, but then would release them back into the streets. So they weren't willing to believe that they were totally free until now. Like now you go out and now it's a vibe, right? That you feel. It's not like any actual number or something that you can say, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. You feel it all around you, the optimism. I think, even we arrived during when gangs were still around, but even then, like Salvadorans are just unnaturally nice. Like it's like they're the nicest people.
Extremely nice.
It's so
Extremely
bizarre
nice. Yeah.
because that was the first huge like gap between what I read online, which is like when we were going to El Salvador the first time, I Googled it, and the only headlines were negative headlines, murder capital of the world. And I was like, oh my God, like we've been to Mexico a few times, but it's like, it's called dangerous, but it's like edgy in some places, but it has great food and all this stuff. Been to Argentina, been to Uruguay, been to Colombia, been to Brazil. And so I was genuinely expecting, who were we telling the other day? Like I expected to just be stabbed at the airport, stabbed to death. Like I didn't think we would make it out of the airport. Like I had told my uncle, from the runway in Miami, I was like, hey, just so you know, we're about to die. And he's like, what's going on? What's happening? And I was like, we're going to El Salvador. He goes, why? I'm like, it's a long story. It's just a long story. But we made it out of the airport. But like, I was not expecting people to be so nice. Like everybody was really nice. And it was because in my mind, I was expecting at least like, going through Cancun parts of that, like, you feel like or Acapulco, it's like a little rough. Like I expected more roughness, but everybody like so nice. And I was like, how are these people killers? Like, how is this even possible? That's all the headlines about you are evil. Like no nice headlines at all at that time. None. And so think of that, right? Think of the burden of that. You're also liberated from that, because if everybody is showing up and they're afraid of you, they're thinking like you're an evil killer. Like that's what I expected. Like that I would be stabbed to death by the time I got out of the airport. As a country, like you're viewed as that, but even as a citywide, because like when I told you we went to the 3 areas where I saw they had arrested the most gang members: Ilopango, Apopa, and Soyapango. When we went in, we had this young woman, Salvadoran woman, who is fluent in English. She's a translator, and she would come to each location with us. And for Apopa was the 3rd place we went, and she said, "I'm not going with you. I'm sorry. It's too dangerous, and I won't go into Apopa." But then she showed up in the morning, and she went with us, and she said, "You know what? I thought if those 2 gringos are willing to go die, then I'm going to as well, because this is my country, and I shouldn't be afraid of Salvadorans, like, because I'm Salvadoran." Mm-hmm. And again, think of that psychological burden, that scar on the population, that you're afraid of an entire city of your own people, right? That you're afraid to go in there. And think of then the people from Apopa, that people are afraid of you and they run away from you and they fear you. I just think it's like it's a psychological wound. It's like it causes damage to the people there and to the society. Now those wounds are healing, right? Those are like, people are now free, and they're not afraid to go to Apopa. They're not afraid to go to Soyapango. They're not afraid to go to Ilopango. So I think, it takes a while for that to ripple through to economic growth and to cultural growth and to the transformation. But I think it started, it was slowly, and I think it's suddenly happening now. I think people are starting to see that it's real and they believe it. And I think amazing things are coming. I call it Renaissance 2.0.
I saw that there was quite a lot of construction work going on there. And then when my friend Macroscope 17 visited as well, probably 2 years after I first did, and his report was really so refreshing to read from an investor's point of view as well. And he really pretty much wrote that everything that I'd seen had continued, and that progress and momentum had continued. And
well, the biggest event that I saw, Stacy started this program called Cubo Plus, which is an education program. And some of these students ended up going to Europe, going to Italy, going to Switzerland. And you really see in a moment the whole story, because a student, a younger person, maybe in their teens, early 20s, they grew up in the gang violence, and their sense of themselves is quite horrible, quite low, that they are the murder capital of the world, and the humiliation, as Stacy was talking about, is a daily experience. Suddenly, they're in the middle of a chateau landscape, mountainous Switzerland, and people come up to them and say, "Where are you from?" And they say, "El Salvador." And the feedback they get is, "Oh my God, it's so great there. Bukele's amazing. Don't you love it?" And get this amazing response. And I witnessed, really in a flash, a complete and utter transformation of somebody being reborn on the spot. They suddenly, it all was in the past suddenly, and that they were present, and they had been gifted a life. They've been gifted a life. And so obviously with the president's popularity in the 90 percentile, because he has gifted the gift of life to 6.5 million people.
Yeah, because think of that. We're American, so we always go, we're the best. We're number one. It doesn't matter if we are or not. We say we are. Right? We're number one at everything. So we grew up with that, especially boomers. Like they had definitely, they think they're number one at everything. But Salvadorans had grown up thinking, you know, a lot of our friends say that they would like try to fake their accent. They would be embarrassed to tell people they're from El Salvador. You know, oh dear, you're from El Salvador. Now, imagine that. Like, I can't even imagine actually what it really feels like. I've seen it on their faces, and I've seen the transformation in some young people I know, that they've gone from being that sort of person that feels like embarrassed to be like, you know, a part of them. That's like, you're born in that town, that country, that road, like that, with those family, like your identity itself was part of your identity was something that you were ashamed of. And now you're so proud, and like and people want to be you. People want to buy your passport. People want to live in El Salvador. People want to hear your story. Like nobody wanted to hear their story before, right? So I think that the value of that is everything. Like when people look at, you know, what is the GDP growth or what is that number? And it's like, how do you even put a number on that? Like, how do you assign some sort of value to that? As Max said, it's life itself. It's like everything.
Well, in addition to that, GDP has grown.
Yes.
Tourism has boomed.
Yeah.
You know, when I was there, and I thought, you know what, this country is going to kick ass because all they need to do is fix the basics. And for the next 10, 20 years, this place is going to boom just on the back of that. And and you know, the economic growth that would ride off just having things that worked properly. And I just wonder if you could share some examples of things that they've built, because we've seen the gorgeous library that's been built in, I think, San Salvador. That's just absolutely fantastic. And there are some civic in the civic centers, town centers, for people to sort of hang around and do things and take pride in, you know, the nation's capital. But I wonder if you can share with us some other things that have progressed
Well,
in the last 3-4 years.
we were actually at the groundbreaking for the library with the president. We had gone downtown, the Centro Historico, January of 2022. And we went down there with Congressman William Soriano. Remember, we went down there at like 11 p.m. at night, maybe 10 p.m. at night. Total darkness. We had some of the congressman had some security with him, some police. But we were the only 3 people and his 2 police officers down there, and like 1 or 2 homeless people. That's it. Nobody else at all. Now you go down there and there are literally thousands and thousands of people there at 10 o'clock at night. But downtown Centro Historico was one of the most dangerous areas of San Salvador, of all of El Salvador, in fact. But that was a transformation that had actually begun under Mayor Najib Bukele, right? He used to be the mayor of San Salvador, and so he began the restoration of downtown San Salvador, which was it's a long program it's paso a paso, as he always says, step by step. But certainly the suddenly part began with the breaking of the ground of the National Library. But it's like also the National Palace has just reopened to the public. That had been restored, and I don't think it had ever been open to the public, or at least not for quite a few decades. It's now open to the public. We just held a Kubo Plus, like our Bitcoin and Lightning Devs program. We had our graduation there for the class of 2024. We held that in January in the National Palace. Wow, it was so beautiful. But the highways, so you saw most recently he opened up the Surf City 2. So that, just look at the images, search that on x.com, go there and look for Bukele Surf City 2 and look at those images. It's totally stunning. It's beautiful coastline, but which had been kind of, economically deprived, just in the eastern part of the country, which had never received much infrastructure spend from the government. And now he's spending a lot building these beautiful roads out there, infrastructure, water lines, sewage, like all the stuff that you need to develop. He's spending a lot doing that, and it's really quite stunning because El Salvador, you know, it's undeveloped and untapped in many places that just look like paradise, right? So it kind
It
of
is
missed.
paradise. I felt that way, and the photos I took looked that way, and the food we ate. So I just happened to be there when Walker and Carla were also there, and
Yeah.
we stopped over at this place. And I wonder, Stacey, if you know exactly where this is, but it was just kind of like a road stop on the edge of a cliff. There's like a seafood restaurant,
Bellows.
and
Yeah.
That
The,
starts to be.
literally on the edge of a cliff. And
Yeah.
we
yeah.
stopped over on the way back from the volcano, and we
Uh-huh.
were hungry. We sat down. We ordered some seafood. I think Walker got like a seafood soup, and honest to God,
Ceviche, yeah.
it was filled
Oh,
with so much seafood. If that was ordered in London, it would have been a platter, and it would have cost about 180 quid. It was
yeah.
just incredible, and probably a lot fresher as well from El Salvador. And just the value that you get. I don't want to say it's cheap. It's not. It's value. It's incredible value. The food is fresh. Everything is made fresh. Um, the coffee is amazing, by the way.
The best coffee in the world. Oh, you get Vina
You know
Fire.
what?
I've sent
I
you
mean,
some.
you know, and President Bukele gifted me some, as he has a few other Bitcoiners as well. But the real comment I want to make about coffee is that, you know, it's one of the few things that I really look forward to every day, and it's just part of my ritual, right? So I really care. I'm not a coffee snob. I don't know it very technically, but I know what I like, and I know when I taste it if it's up to scratch. And usually when I go on holiday, the hotels are just miserable. It's, you know, you're not going to get good coffee at a hotel. But we stayed at 2 hotels there in the space of a week, and both made exceptionally good coffee,
Oh,
let
yeah.
alone good coffee for a hotel. That I was so taken aback by that. I didn't expect it. But it was fresh, it was delicious, and it was really, really well made. So I highly recommend a Salvadorian coffee.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Yeah, getting back to the president, I think if he wasn't the president, he would be working in the interior as a planner and civil planner. He seems really happy when you mention something like, "Oh, I noticed some new lighting on the highway to El Zante." He'll give you the exact square footage, the number of lights, the wattage, the voltage, and just go into it like layer after layer, like deeply into this project, like. This is then he just lights up like yeah, this is what he loves. He loves building roads, building bridges, building seafront. He loves all that. He knows every square foot of this relatively small country. He knows it. He's working on it and improving it like as master architect, and that's what he really loves doing.
And that's important because he has a great aesthetic. I mean, you could see it. Actually, President Trump mentioned it in his meeting with President Bukele.
I missed that.
He mentioned the aesthetic, how great his videos are that he's posts, right? So he has an amazing aesthetic. You could see it downtown in the Centro Historico. It's like there's a harmony and a beauty to it, right? He understands beauty, and that's very rare. He's a genuine Renaissance man in that way. That's why it's Renaissance 2.0 is not just like magicked up. You have to have a vision and a plan and a strategy for it. Like you have to, like all of this is by design. None of it is just like, okay, let's see what happens. He's like plans it to be beautiful. That's why that just again search on X, Twitter, go look and say Bukele Surf City 2, and you'll see how beautiful it is. Right? It's an aesthetic, and this everything that he puts his hand to, like the highways, like the roads, like the color of the lights, like it's all designed and it's so beautiful, and that's really important because so many countries, as you mentioned, the tourism boom. Tourism can wreck a country, right? It can wreck the beauty, the natural beauty, through ugly design or thoughtless design, careless. Like especially in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of like Cancun. If you look at Cancun, there's parts of it is just like quite tacky and ugly, right? You don't have that. Like it's just lush and tropical luxe. It's just like aesthetically beautiful. It's paradise, and El Salvador is so beautiful, and it has a charm, and it just feels luxury and refined, just like the president, right? He doesn't look down market. He looks very luxe. He looks just like the country, basically.
Aims up.
What's that?
Aims up.
Oh,
Aspirationally aims up to, aspires for a higher level of design and aesthetic.
aspirational.
Yeah, it projects an aesthetic rather than, let's say, raw power. So often you have countries will want to project raw power. So you have like the brutalist architecture of London post-war, or communist architecture, which is very blunt and, built by military people. Here it's more like Florence or Paris, or a European aesthetic, or a Central American and Latin American influence, I should say. If I knew the culture better, I would be able to speak on it in those intelligent terms. But I know European culture better, so I have to go through my own filter. But if I knew the Central and Latin American culture better, I could give you more concrete examples of that history. But it has it has a very reinforcing positivity about it.
Yes.
And like the main thoroughfare in where the presidential tower is in near San Benito, they redid that entire boulevard, and they did it, in a way that it looks like it's been there for 30 years, right? It doesn't look like they just plopped in some new features and stones and things. They did it in a way that's completely balanced, with the mountains in the background, the buildings in the foreground. They use the materials are, because you're in the tropics, you have to use stone and concrete and bricks, but fashioned in a way that's that gives them a light quality, a lightness to them, and some public spaces. And of course, they're blessed with a lot of jungle, so there's plants everywhere, and trees and plants and exotic birds and things like that. And so, and everyone, I think, just is uplifted so much by being surrounded by this type of aesthetic and beauty.
It does sound so beautiful. I can't wait to return. A little while ago, El Salvador hit the news again. This time because of a loan that they had agreed to, some financing or refinancing they had agreed to with the IMF, and there were certain conditions that the IMF sort of ratcheted into the documentation, and I didn't really quite understand it, to be honest with you, because the wording seemed kind of innocuous, but then the commentary that came out after was about, oh no, they can't buy any Bitcoin anymore, but yet we're seeing every single day they're buying Bitcoin. So like, what is the truth? Like, what is the situation here? Because I don't really understand what has changed. I don't see any change.
Exactly. Archie, you're right. There hasn't been any change. And I say that, and I've said that. I run the Bitcoin office for President Bukele. And I told people, nothing's changed. This is what we're doing. And there was some commentary from a few people who, like to claim a lot of credit for the stuff we've built, and
Sure.
the fact is that nothing has changed substantially. Obviously, if a few things at the margin have changed, just some phrases and text, but at the end of the day, we're still Bitcoin country. President Bukele, man, like, he has done so much for Bitcoin and is such a Bitcoiner. And now that other leaders around the world have entered the arena, even more so can you see with the juxtaposition just how amazing President Bukele has been. And you think of it, he was all alone on the world stage as Bitcoin country in 2021, 2022, through Terra Luna, through FTX, through Celsius, all that crash, all the collapse. And he remained so determined, so calm, so confident, and so so much a Bitcoiner. Like never panicked, never shitcoined, never did any of that stuff. And there were a few people who said a lot of negative stuff for which was totally unjustified. I believe. We are still buying Bitcoin. We're buying Bitcoin. Okay. Like, and I tell people this, I've told them, I've said it on Twitter, and they just then go, well, they must be transferring it from somewhere else. I'm like, no, I told you, we just bought it. We bought this Bitcoin. I know, I'm telling you. We are the most transparent government in the world. Okay. Everybody knows our public address. You can go to our mempool space. It's right there. You see us adding the Bitcoin. Like, we have put in the work in a way that no other country has remotely done. Okay. It's not just our strategic Bitcoin reserve, which we did first. We have Bitcoin education that is so deep and wide throughout the entire country. We're from this month, actually maybe May, early May, we're introducing into second and third grade, like this Bitcoin workbook. We're teaching second and third graders, like 6, 7, 8 years old. We're teaching them about Bitcoin and money. We just finished those 2 workbooks with Lena Seish of Little Hodler. These are like pretty amazing books. They'll be open source, so anybody can download it. But you'll see, like this, like top-notch stuff. We're teaching our kids from 6 to 7 years old about Bitcoin. We taught 80,000 civil servants in a 3-day program about Bitcoin. 80,000. That's me and Max did the masterclass 1.5 hour video, and then Giacomo Zucco does a 3-day deep dive into Bitcoin and a lot of technical and philosophical, historical context. We have Kuba Plus. We have a workbook, a diploma in high school. So like we're none of it is just a LARP. None of it is just marketing. Like we are putting in so much work and so much conviction on the part of President Bukele and building something amazing, not just for like easy headlines that some other leaders around the world are doing just to like get the Bitcoin media attention. We're putting in the effort to build something quite extraordinary. And I think that says more than anything else, just the proof of work, the actual proof of work of what President Bukele has done for El Salvador in terms of Bitcoin and liberating the people not only physically from the dangers of the plunder of the gangs, but from the plunder of inflation, and teaching them from second grade, third grade, fourth grade, all the way up to university level. We have like the best Bitcoin education in a very deep way, in a profound philosophical, ideological. We teach them everything, ethics, like all the history of money over and over. It's being repeated in every year from 6 years old up to 26 years old. So, if that's not enough for a few people who spoke loudly about it, and then that's their problem. It's no reflection on us. Like we're putting in the effort, and no, I work very closely with President Bukele, and he is just completely solid, and his conviction about this is so legitimate, and so his determination is real. And I think proof of work. We just keep building, and nothing stops this train.
I love that. I mean, I think sometimes on a timeline, cynicism becomes a kind of sport where,
Yes.
there's not much happening. And so let's just pick on something. Sometimes, El Salvador becomes an easy target, particularly because you have a fairly young, charismatic leader. And if something doesn't quite look right, according to whoever's
Yeah.
standards, some Puritan standards. But like sometimes we need to just take a step back. And I think I posted at the time something to the effect of, if El Salvador never buys another Bitcoin and all they do is hold on to
Yes.
what they've bought, they will have done more for Bitcoin just by purchasing that alone, nothing
Yes.
else. They will have done more for Bitcoin than anybody could have reasonably expected from such a small country that is trying to get up off its feet, let alone
Yes.
all of the programs that you've just mentioned. And
Yeah.
just stop and think for a moment. If you're an American, if you're British, wherever you are in some Western country, and just stop and imagine that your country had all of the education initiatives that Stacy just outlined
Yeah.
in your schools. Would you think
Exactly.
that that was no big deal?
Yeah, I mean the concessions were de minimis, and you're going to swap the IMF out of your cap table with, and you're going to pay 300 to 400% more in interest, right? You're talking 300 to 400 basis points more in interest if you swap the IMF off the cap table. So you keep them on the cap table, you pay very, very little interest. And for what? The concessions were de minimis, were minimal, it's laughable. And for me, what's even more laughable is that the IMF talks about how Bitcoin is destabilizing economies, and they're concerned. And yet, Donald Trump in America, which is 16 or 17% of the IMF, is adding Bitcoin to add stability, against the fiat money in the central banks. So there's a huge disconnect with these two institutions. And when that resolves itself, I'm 100% certain I know who the loser will be. It'll be the IMF. So this is the IMF's last hurrah. They've been around a while. This post-World War II, creation, that was part of the reorganization with the World Bank and these other folks. And they're all being washed away. And that's another 5 years from now, they'll be gone. And El Salvador will be incredibly richer as a result of stacking sats. And we'll all have a good laugh. Like, remember when those clowns came in here and talked about instability as it relates to Bitcoin? It's as I wrote in Bitcoin magazine in my inaugural column on the relaunch of the magazine. I wrote a piece in there called "Who's the Banana Republic Now, Bitch?" And I went into detail about how the world is shifting and the people stuck in central bank land are becoming the banana republic. And the Bitcoin powerhouses, of which El Salvador is one of them, are really now in the first world of Bitcoin. So this is the transformation that's taking place. If you can't see it, then you don't understand Bitcoin.
And President Bukele has a clear vision of greatness for El Salvador. And he will do what it takes to get there. And he has the perseverance, the determination, all the qualities of a great leader. And that's why we're getting there. That's why it's happening, because he is like the honey badger that, Bitcoiners used to celebrate. Honey badger doesn't exist too much anymore, but very few people realize just how we did this almost single-handedly. It was the first year and a half of Bitcoin legal tender. It was just the president, me, Max, right? That's it. We were building all this stuff. The price collapsed of all the coins, right? As I mentioned, Celsius, FTX, and all those things blew up. He didn't waver, right? He just kept going forward. We kept building excellence. We were pioneers. They always say the pioneers have the arrows in their backs. We just kept going and building, just excellence only, building for the best and the brightest. We kept, I would always say, let's just build for the best and the brightest, because that's the best and the brightest are in Bitcoin. They don't have marketing teams like all the shitcoins, but they're there. And if we keep on building real stuff, amazing things, they're going to come, and they'll keep on coming. And we've built that stuff. Remember, we're the first to do the strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, as you said, like the things, like even if we never bought another Bitcoin, like the things that we trailblazed, it'll be in the history books 500 years from now what we did. We did it on our own. Like, we didn't have the help of a printing press. We didn't have the UN on our side. Like, we didn't have any great powers on our side except for the power of conviction and a vision.
Yeah, and you see a lot of armchair pundits pontificating about this and about that and what El Salvador can do or should do. These got a 92% popularity from the people who are Salvadorans. So that's who I look for as my signal, the signal I look at. I'm like, well, he works for this country, and the country he's the most popular leader in the world. So who am I, to
exactly
question this?
So on the topic of the IMF, and there's a blossoming relationship there between President Trump and Bukele, and the IMF is essentially what it's pretty much run by the United States. So what is the chance of something positive coming out of that?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that the IMF is the one that bent the knee. They've been trying for 4 years. That this was a loan negotiation that had been in the process since before President Bukele came into office. He's the one that, they came in as, saying that he needs to get rid of Bitcoin completely. And he never backed down. He said, no, then take your money elsewhere. So they're the ones that bent the knee and allowed, they gave the loan with us not giving up Bitcoin. So we're still buying Bitcoin. We have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. We have Bitcoin in our education system. Nowhere else on earth has anything remotely, not even a little bit similar to what we have in terms of education. And that, I believe, is going to be a massive moat that people don't understand, the transformation of the mind that is happening, of the mindset that is happening. And by the way, President Bukele said that in 2023 on September 15th at the Independence Day speech that he gives to the nation. He said that, I delivered this liberty, right? You have the liberty, you have freedom now, and it's your turn now. You have to move to the front of the class. You have to start leading the class, and you have to shift your mindset. You can win. We can win. We're winners now. And so this is part of a shift of mindset. Nobody else on earth has the winning mindset more than the Bitcoiners, right? Bitcoiners were saying it back in 2010, 2011 that, when we look at Hal Finney, his words, when Bitcoin goes to $1 million a coin, and it was like, it wasn't even a penny a Bitcoin. Yeah. So he was already talking about it being $1 million. And you're like, that's the mindset of a Bitcoiner, right? You realize this tool, you realize the extraordinary beauty of it. And you're like, well, I see it. Everybody else is going to see it, and therefore it's going to be $1 million. So let's start planning for that. And that's how President Bukele, he has that vision already too for El Salvador, the same that Hal Finney had for Bitcoin when there was no price on Bitcoin, when it was worth zero. But in his mind, it was already worth $1 million a coin, and that's the way President Bukele believes in El Salvador. It's we're already a great nation. An extraordinary story that the history books will talk about us in 500 years. So let's just act like it. And so we already have that moat of that mindset being built through our education system. And I think with President Trump, yeah, because what is, so the wording that in the past, the IMF had used, while, yes, the number one country of the IMF is the United States, and Biden was very, as you mentioned, the Democrats were very anti-Bitcoin and also anti-President Bukele because they didn't like the sovereignty and the independence of his the way he acted about running his own country. So when you see there, if you look back, even before Trump had announced his candidacy, so you look at those words that they used about Bitcoin and how much of a risk it is and how it can destabilize economies, then you start to think, well, okay, these are bureaucrats who have cushy jobs and, and they want this on their resume that they had these jobs. And now you see Trump and Elon like disappearing USAID. Like, who would have ever thought that USAID could just disappear overnight? That was a huge power projection for a certain class of deep state sort of person, and it just disappeared overnight. So, are you going to look at this sort of action and think, well, we're going to be harsh on Bitcoin now that the United States is like adopting Bitcoin? They want very similar policies to El Salvador. They want a strategic reserve like El Salvador. I think you're going to see that their language will have to change just by the very nature of who funds them, who they are, right? Like the voting, they won't exist tomorrow if the United States decides that they don't exist tomorrow. So if the U.S. economic interest, as we see with Trump, like he's willing to overthrow the playing board completely if he feels that the United States is being disadvantaged. So if he's, issued that executive order, he says he's doing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. He says all this stuff. He's very pro Bitcoin. His children are in Bitcoin and crypto. So I don't know. My assumption, I don't have any insight. I haven't spoken to President Trump. Just from what I observe, and as a former, television news analyst, I would say it seems like if I were at the, if I wouldn't want to be a bureaucrat at an institution funded by the United States, by that guy, and go against what his whole economic plan is for the United States. I wouldn't. I would change my wording, perhaps.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point, there is an enormous amount of goodwill building between Trump and Bukele. Bukele has definitely ingratiated himself with Trump, the administration, and there's that seems like it's the beginning of a blossoming relationship, including Elon Musk and others. And an archaic legacy institution like the IMF or the World Bank, I don't see them surviving in this type of environment and much longer.
You guys have set a really good example with all the initiatives and programs that you just told us about, Stacy. And I wonder whether or not, when Milei was elected in Argentina, there were great hopes for perhaps that they would sort of move along the lines of, or at least a little closer to what El Salvador is doing. But have there been any kind of approach or relationship forming in that regard? Because at the moment, up until this point, he's kind of been a bit of a disappointment, to be honest. But I wonder if there's anything going on behind the scenes about those two nations getting closer together.
Well, I work in government now, so I would say to be diplomatic, Argentina has their own set of problems, right? That are, they have several already existing multi-tens of billions of dollar outstanding loans to the IMF, and conditions that the IMF had already set prior to Javier Milei taking the presidency, where, I believe right before him, they had taken like a $60 billion loan, and they had signed the agreement saying that they wouldn't adopt crypto as they wouldn't do any Bitcoin legal tender sort of thing. He's driven down inflation, which was a huge problem there, and he's slashed the bureaucracy. Talk about a money printing state. I mean, wow, that was a basket case of money printing. The end result was pretty dire. In terms of Bitcoin, I don't see. I see them more as kind of like a digital assets. Well, he himself has said like he wants to dollarize his economy. He's still at that point of wanting to dollarize the economy. El Salvador is already a dollarized economy since like 2001. So we were already at that stage, which is in a kind of a hard money standard, right? Because you can't print it. There's no central bank of El Salvador that can print dollars. Same in Argentina. So it does start to shift the mindset and the economy, and you need to be more proof of work because you can't just print the money. So maybe it's on a longer timeline that they're going to be operating on rather than just going straight to Bitcoin. But yeah, I see them more as like, as Max had pointed out too, is like, you really become who you hang out with, is that the Chinese proverb, right? That it depends on who's advising you and who you let into your inner circle, who you decide to listen to. And there are more crypto people in the world with marketing budgets who, will take the time. Well, they have the money to just like go, like, lobby a government to adopt crypto and blockchain policies. There aren't many of Max and Stacy's who will, do this sort of work. It's hard work. It's a lot of work to, work in a government and shift policy, to introduce these frameworks and to understand the entire ecosystem and what the end result would be, where a certain path would take you, and each country has their own unique set of issues, and El Salvador was in the right place at the right time, and had the right leader. In the United States, for example, there are deep liquid capital markets which don't exist in El Salvador. But in a way that made it easier to say, well, Bitcoin only, right? Because that is the only capital in the crypto markets. You don't need, it's easier to not be confused by those 20 million other coins, right? Whereas in the United States, like, it's easier to see it as just a tech story because you already have the world's reserve currency and you have huge, deep, liquid markets that can take anything. It could take the financial collapse. It could take all the mortgage fraud. It could take all that stuff. It could bail out the world. It can fund the IMF. It can fund the UN. It can fund NATO. It can fund the World Bank. It could fund all these things, right? So it's easier to just like look at crypto and just like, yeah, let's do all 20 million coins. Let's let all of this rain down on us. Whereas I think just like with poetry, like if you have to write it in iambic pentameter, it's restrictive, but it's liberating as well, right? So we were economic liberty and Bitcoin were the obvious, easier choice in the end, rather than having to go down that path of crypto and making all those mistakes and allowing in all those frauds and scams and rug pulls and wasted energy and time. Most importantly, like you have, this is our first impression. El Salvador was a failed state for 50 years, and now it's the beginning. It's a Renaissance 2.0, and here you're making your first impression. You're building a new El Salvador. So how do you build it? What do you want to be? Like the first statement you make, the first things you do, make a profound statement. And I think Argentina is in a different place in its arc of history. And same with the United States. So each country is going to come at it in their own unique economic place in history. I think El Salvador happened to have the right leader at the right time in the right place in its history.
Yeah, I think El Salvador is a startup, El Salvador is a and Argentina is a turnaround, right? So as a turnaround in Argentina, it's like, recently Microsoft went through a turnaround. The stock had been dead for years and their products were terrible. They brought in a new CEO. It's $1 trillion company plus, and they turned it around. Now it's growing again. Or, Jack Welch at General Electric, the turnaround king, the restructuring king. You have an established business. Argentina wasn't established, been around for a long time. It's a very big economy. Milei had to come in and change the whole course of that economy, like changing the course of a river, an active river. And I think they just reported a surplus in their budget for the first time just this past week. So he's had an amazing impact on cost cutting, like Jack Welch at General Electric, cost cutting, getting rid of overhead. And that's proof of stake versus proof of work versus proof of stake, because the proof of stake with Argentina was just print, 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 print. So now he's come in and said, no, we're going to get rid of all that bureaucracy and printing. Whereas El Salvador is a startup. So it's a startup, and a few key people at the right time at the right place came together. And one of the components of that startup success in El Salvador was Bitcoin Beach, which was a thriving beach community that was the beginning of Bitcoin country. And Mike Peterson and his folks down at Bitcoin Beach started this circular economy out of a need for foreigners who wanted to go surfing to be able to buy pupusas in the currency that wasn't going to have to be translated into their domestic currency without taking a 30-minute drive to the local bank, right? So Bitcoin was perfect for that. Then adoption heated up. This caught the attention of Jack Mallers at Strike. He came to El Salvador. He met with the president's team. And those guys drafted the idea of making Bitcoin legal tender, really. So Jack Mallers at Strike and the president's team, and then they went to the Bitcoin conference of 2021, like you would go to a conference in Silicon Valley where the company is just announcing a strategic deal, right? It's a startup country. And they said, we're making Bitcoin legal tender. This brought Max and Stacy, right? 3 months later, we said, you know what? This is interesting. We've been doing this since the beginning. Let's move there, because this is the most interesting story in Bitcoin, and that's the genesis of it. And so that's how you contrast it, those two countries in that way. And a lot of times with startups, 8 or 90% of them fail, and very rarely do they succeed. In El Salvador, it is a success story. I think now we've passed the point where we no longer have doubts. This is going to be a major story going forward for the next 50, 100 years, El Salvador. And it's already changing a lot that's going on. And obviously you see it in the policies in Washington, D.C., where they're doing Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and Bitcoin education products, whether they admit it or not or acknowledge it or not. They're based on El Salvador.
Yes. President Bukele deserves a lot more credit than he gets for basically transforming the whole world. Like he was that first mover, right? That was bold enough to do this and withstand all the mockery of the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, all the financial press at that time ganged up just like the Biden administration to laugh, like, how dare this little country, this failed state, do this? And of course, we have the last laugh as everybody is adopting our policies, except for they haven't figured out how to do the education yet. And I think that's the important ingredient that they're missing. And they're just focusing on the big item because of the proof of stake mindset, right? Hey, we have all this money, all these dollars, we can buy all this Bitcoin. It's like, okay, but you need the mindset shift too. You need the people to be ready for a proof of work world.
As a Bitcoiner, I'll forever be grateful for El Salvador for breaking the ice on the arena of nation-state adoption, and for all the great example that it's actually set for many, many nations.
Yes.
2024 was the year of the Bitcoin ETF, without a doubt. I mean, it was a crazy, insane success. I don't think anybody, well, I wouldn't think many people anticipated that level of success. I don't think too many of the ETF experts were anticipating that kind of success, and I don't think too many Bitcoiners even predict that in the first year it would attract so much capital. And then we sort of had a bit of a plateau for about 6 or 8, 9 months in the price, until there was a resurgence in the polls of Donald Trump's prospects to win the next presidency. And there was quite a bit of anticipation of that happening, and the price ran up. And then upon confirmation, when he was sworn in, the pump continued. And so here we are 3 months later, and we're consolidating, what is it now, about 85,000 US dollars. Where do you see Bitcoin now in terms of, I guess, there are two things really. Like people think of Bitcoin in terms of for the rest of this year, and also the rest of the cycle, if you even believe in those anymore.
I think the most important thing of 2024 in the past 12 months would be that Ethereum is down 62% against Bitcoin. I think that's really important because there is no second best. I think that's what the ETF showed. And I had said it publicly. Max often talks about it and credits that I said that. At that time, before the Ethereum ETF launched, I did a Google Trends search. And I said, up until now, there has not only been the unit bias, but also the fact that all these crypto and Bitcoin only trade on these exchanges that have a lot of wash trading, and they count the market cap of all the pre-mine, right? And so at least 50% of Ethereum is still owned by the pre-mine holders, right? So there was no cost to production of that. They have this pre-mine.
That supply is not in the market. It hasn't been.
It's not in the market, right? Bitcoin is in the market, all of it. So it was always painting a picture as if this was a sector, that there were crypto was a thing, and Bitcoin was one of these cryptos. And I said, looking at the Google Trends, and you could see that if you did Bitcoin versus Ethereum, that Bitcoin was way up here and Ethereum was way down there. But it got even clearer when you also said Bitcoin and then compare it on Google Trends, Ethereum, Cardano, Solana, all of the top 10, if you did a comparison between Bitcoin and the top 10 crypto, other than the stable coins, you could see that Ethereum was actually way down there with Cardano. If you just did those three, Bitcoin, Cardano, and Ethereum, and Cardano is like nothing, right? There's like no transactions on it or at all. There's nothing there. And Ethereum was closer to Cardano in the global mind share than Bitcoin. So I said that would translate to Wall Street. I guarantee you that's what will happen on Wall Street. It was like 30-1. And you know what? The inflows, I just did this today on Twitter. If I asked Grok, compare the inflows into the Ethereum versus Bitcoin ETF. Well, the Bitcoin ETF has had 35 billion in inflows, and Ethereum has had 1 billion. It's an utter failure. That's why it's down 62% against Bitcoin, and it will continue to fall. So when they say they're going to do an XRP and a Solana ETF, I'm like, bring it on, because you know what? There's no wash trading on Wall Street on a particular coin like that. Maybe there is somewhere in the markets, but they're not. The owners of the exchanges are not wash trading. Maybe some high frequency traders might be doing it in some places, but there's no unit bias, right? So there's only the narrative, there's only the story. And that's what I said then. I said, how are they going to pitch Ethereum? And you know what? They still haven't figured out how to pitch Ethereum, and they're not going to figure out how to pitch Ripple. They're not going to figure out.
I was never attracted to Ethereum to begin with, but one of the things that really stood out very early on was that it was easily substitutable and it had no defensive moat. Whenever I asked anybody about that, they said, "Oh, it's got all the devs, so that means all the products will be." I go, "Yeah, but the people who are buying it, they don't care if whatever they're buying, whatever they're doing, whatever they're transacting is on that or on another blockchain. They really don't care. And if that's the case, what's stopping something else from getting market share?"
Sure.
If people don't care where they buy it from them, and ultimately they're the ones who decide, not the devs.
Most of the transactions on Ethereum are stable coins, i.e. dollars. People are just wanting to access US dollars on a blockchain. Okay?
Sure, but it can be on any blockchain, right?
It could be on any blockchain. And staking. And staking is like, so even if you were paid 20% yield, you're down 62% against Bitcoin. So what's the point of collecting 20% yield? And where's the yield coming from? It's a total, right? Mm-hmm. Like you get into this, the risk of holding an asset that is a yield product, that where's the yield coming from? If it, like, a yield can only come from a Ponzi scheme, right? Or an inflationary
We've learned the
thing.
lesson from last cycle of how catastrophic it was to chase yield. But here we are again. And
no, there's no collective wisdom when it comes to finance.
No.
right? As P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute. The half-life for financial stupidity is 4 years, right? Every 4 years, there's a new generation that gets their clock cleaned. And it's been that way for 1,000 years, and it's never going to change. But, the chart, the price chart, as I often say, is only one chart, and it's not really the most interesting chart. So I'll give you two other charts to look at. One would be the 200-week moving average, which you see it's a 45-degree angle pointed up, hasn't changed in 15
Almost
years,
constantly, yes.
right? And the other one would be the hash rate, which is just screaming to new all-time highs all the time. And that's the true power of where the true conviction is. ETF holders are not don't have a lot of conviction. They'll buy and sell ETFs every 3 months, 4 months. Their brokers call them up and say, dump your Bitcoin ETF and buy this other ETF. And they're just trading. They don't even know what Bitcoin is, and they have no conviction in Bitcoin at all. They're just trading stuff. And the real conviction with Bitcoin is with the hash rate and the computational power being thrown at the network. And those are the primary risk takers. The people who buy and sell Bitcoin are not the primary risk takers. And contrast hash rate and network growth with, let's say, what happens in the oil industry. When oil prices come down, drilling stops, rig count goes down, right? I remember in the 80s when I was on Wall Street, Houston was the see-through city, right? Because the energy prices came down, and so did rigging, so did drilling. But it doesn't matter what the price is. The hash rate keeps going up. It's completely price insensitive. Nobody who's in the business cares what the price is because they have conviction that everything eventually goes to zero against Bitcoin. And it's happening on a faster and faster timeline. So I don't care what the price is today. I just want as much Bitcoin as I possibly can because everything is going to zero against Bitcoin. That's conviction. And that's what the people who throw money at the network, who have sunken costs, who are actually throwing cash, raising money and dumping it into the ground to build miners, out in Texas. They have conviction in this industry that has not been seen in any other industry, I don't think. Maybe the 49ers, the gold miners in California in 1849, perhaps you would see a similar phenomenon of highly folks with great conviction. But that industry ultimately leads to a commodity that is not inelastic. Only with Bitcoin is it a finite supply. So it's infinite demand meets absolute scarcity. So you put those two together, and you're going to end up with everything going to zero against it. And the daily price chart is not telling you the information you need to know. Look at these other factors, these other charts to get a better picture of what's really happening.
So proof positive that you can never truly have enough Bitcoin is the guy who gave 10,000 Bitcoin to Alex Jones is still accumulating Bitcoin. So all these years later.
Because you're attracted to it. There's a lot of work coming out psychologically. The idea of absolute scarcity is baked into our DNA and highly desirable. Human beings are programmed to be attracted to something of absolute scarcity. And this means that you've got a proposition of infinite demand on absolute digital scarcity existing entirely outside the control of any entity or any state. Then you put that all together and you end up with the global social, political, economic revolution. And in just 15 years, we've gone from Amir Taki talking about it as swapping thousands of Bitcoin to get a plane ticket to fly to a squat in London to hang out with Peter Todd and write code, to Larry Fink, having FOMO and tripping over his dick to get more Bitcoin. That just took 15 years. I would challenge you to point any time in history like this.
That's really quite Bitcoin hasn't been around that long. I mean, there's so much that's happened in such a short space of time that, but when you think about it, it hasn't been that long at all.
No.
Max, have you ever counted how many you've given away in total?
No, I've lost and given away tons of Bitcoin over the years. But as Stacy was saying, when it was at 50 cents or $1 or $5, it's easy to just give people Bitcoin. You get a lot of Bitcoin. There's a lot of those, not the actual Casasius coins, but knockoffs of Casasius coins, where it's
The scratch off cards.
scratch off coins, with 5, 10, 15, 20 Bitcoin. Just people.
But that's the fiat. Like I said, Bitcoin has a way of spreading. It infected our global minds. Like it's on an evolutionary scale. It wanted to spread. It needed to spread, right? It needs to be a network. And so it got onto network television in a way that would be sent exactly to the people who needed to see it in the third world, developing world, who distrusted the U.S. empire and the U.S. dollar, and they were open and receptive to this message. But all of us were also still thinking fiat, right? So when you gave somebody 100 Bitcoin, you're like, oh, you're a good friend. I'll give you $100. Here's $100. So you're just thinking $100, not 100 Bitcoin, which you should have been thinking 100 Bitcoin. And man, like, you want to keep your 100 Bitcoin. Instead, you were thinking, I'm just giving $100 and it's not a big deal. Which is, looking back in hindsight, it's obviously a huge mistake, but everybody made it. Like Matti Malmi, we'll talk about this, the Finnish developer coder who worked quite closely with Satoshi, and he ran one of the faucets. Gavin Andresen ran another one, and I think Matti Malmi said he gave away like 30,000 on his Bitcoin on his faucet, and I think Gavin gave it away similar amount. So, but again, he wasn't even giving away $30,000 worth. That was like, no dollars worth. There was no market at that price at that time in 2000 until the pizza. When did the pizza come? So, there was no price at that moment. So they were just giving away something that they had almost freely been given, mining it on their laptop.
Home mining. One funny story that I always remember, we went to a conference, a financial hedge fund conference on Malta in maybe 2012 or 2013. And they had, as part of the decorations at this place, the ceiling was packed with helium balloons, balloons up in the ceiling, and each one inside had a private key to a Bitcoin. So there's just hundreds and hundreds of Bitcoin floating up on the ceiling. And so people were told this, and they would grab, and some of them would grab their balloon. It was only worth a few bucks or whatever. So a lot of people just ignored it.
Most people ignored it.
Max and Stacy are on the floor, like trying to popping these balloons, trying to find the little paper scraps.
And it was the private key, and we were just like entering them all and taking them. Yeah. But these bankers were all sitting there just like looking at us like, huh?
Like,
they had no idea what it was.
It's going to $1 million. Trust me. Sure, kid.
Yeah. But those were the days that, it needed to be distributed, because if Matti Malmi, he had the privilege of being one of the first, and being part of history, and being connected with one of the greatest humans to ever live, of Satoshi, who gifted the world with something very important of economic liberty and individual sovereignty. And that's one thing he has that nobody can take from him. But because he was so early, he also has the bad fortune of having given away all of his Bitcoin, because it was so easy and abundant at that time, that the abundance seemed natural and eternal. So then it wasn't, right? I think he gave away 30,000, and I think he spent like another 30,000 on an apartment in Finland, in Helsinki.
Oh, so he doesn't have any more Bitcoin?
Well, I think I don't think he has 60,000 Bitcoin anymore, because he spent some on an apartment, and he gave it away. He doesn't, he's a Bitcoiner. He doesn't say how much Bitcoin he has, but he definitely gave away all of that Bitcoin. So,
yeah, you think about the volatility is a key function. Talk about distribution, in that it helps the distribution of Bitcoin, because volatility, it draws attention.
Yes.
And I know from the Hollywood Stock Exchange, when I designed that in 1996, the virtual specialist technology that runs it creates artificial volatility. The problem with prediction markets or simulated markets online is that they're bid offer, they match markets, and there's no real much in terms of volatility. But with my design, I created a way on the back end to create volatility without disturbing the dynamics of the price parity of all the securities within that market. And that attracted a lot of attention because you can say Mel Gibson's stock dropped 40% today on the Hollywood Stock Exchange. And then I'd go on CNBC and talk about it, which would drive venture capitalists to give us more money. But that volatility was amped on the back end with the virtual specialist technology to exaggerate movements, if you will. And so Bitcoin, because it has extra volatility, it's covered in the papers all the time. Like Bitcoin dropped 40%. Everyone's crying. But,
Sure.
it's got that huge awareness now. Like, what the hell is Bitcoin? It got our awareness, like all these freaks and geeks and the volatility. And, we started covering it because it's a great story to cover. If you have to fill a show, 3 shows a week with content, and there's this wacky new asset class that's got people, slaving away on their home miners, and it blows up every 20 minutes. This is a great story to keep covering, which is what, drove our content for years. I would say from 2011 to 20, then Mount Gox happened in 2014. Really, did the only content in Bitcoin up until the fork wars of 2016, 2017. Then they had some new players emerged, like Jimmy Song, came out.
The Vortex.
This guy, the Vortex, they had a show, BTC World or something, and that was must-watch television. And they really went into depth on the fork wars and the New York Agreement, and really did some good investigative journalism. And but between say 2011 and 2016, 2017, so for 5 years we had basically the monopoly on Bitcoin coverage. And unfortunately, because RT gets censored in the U.S., it wasn't seen a lot in the U.S. But around the world, because RT had a reach of 700 million screens at one point, millions of people around the world were aware of Bitcoin back when it was, $5.
But again, because we were the only content creators, and there were not very many sort of articulate guests that you now see, especially from the macro analysts and stuff like that, who are able to articulate concepts and ideas very well on television. We were in the same position then as we have been with a nation state adoption, right? Like there was no roadmap to follow. There were no books at that time to read and to explain what we were seeing. Nobody knew how to explain it. And even the biggest names didn't understand it, because if they had understood it, they wouldn't have been giving it away by the tens of thousands in a faucet, right? So nobody really understood it. But we were like learning to understand it together. It was like the analogy, the metaphor of the elephant, right? Like if you feel the trunk, or if you feel the back, or the tail, whatever you're feeling when you're in a dark room, it will be what you think it is. And we were all in a dark room, right? We started in the rabbit hole rather than go down the rabbit hole. Most people nowadays go down the rabbit hole. We were like in the rabbit hole immediately, like in the dark, like trying to figure out what this Bitcoin was.
Yeah, Stacy is a natural TV and film producer, as you can discern from listening to her describe the events of that era, because it lends itself to television and film, right? As a producer, because you have to create all the elements, the story, the character, all those
narrative
beats,
arc,
right? Like my contribution has mostly been that I have acting skills, and I'm have experience on Wall Street and technology. Like I have a background in the topic, but I'm not necessarily a producer as such. So I'm more performer / writer. But so the combination is what made everything tick for some 1,900 episodes. We got like 2.5 billion views on the show. And because people were, the original mantra was markets, finance, scandal. So we tried to approach financial news in the way that it would be a tabloid paper would approach the news, the red tops, as they call them in the UK. So that instead of just saying that Jamie Dimon may have violated certain SEC rules when he issued a bond that was not mentioned in the prospectus at last year's annual meeting. We say Jamie Dimon's a fink. He just broke these
he's a
major
tapeworm.
laws. He's a freaking tapeworm.
He's a tapeworm.
He's crawling out of the anus of a financial, world. And so it's like create like this
Well, that's
massive
what
scandal, right?
Max came up with. Like, I would come up with the headline. I would say J.P. Morgan was fined again for this, and that's what. So I had the narrative, the story, and he would come out with the imagery of the
Yeah, so I act it out, right? I act out these things, right? And
improv.
right. Because it's, television is the best thing on television are cartoons. Those are the best suited content for, Tom and Jerry is the best TV show ever. It will always ever be the best TV show is Tom and Jerry. It's just, you have to bring that level of animation to television, in my view, right? So that's what I've been trying to do on these shows.
Max thinks you just need a giant head, a big head.
Also, if you have a big head, like I do, I have a naturally big head. So you just take up screen time. Like whenever I'm doing an interview with somebody else, screen space, like here's some pencil neck on the city of London describing different interest rate differentials. And then they put me next to him on the screen, split screen, and my head's like half a size bigger than this guy's head. So I'm immediately telling more truthful things because I have a bigger head, right? And I'm talking louder. So that definitely means I have more honest and truthful things to say, because that's the way people perceive things on media. And so I'm like, immediately this guy is like shrinking down. It's just like tactics used, media tactics, very interesting. But at the end of the day, the audience ended up being very, very much informed as to what was happening. Before movies like The Big Short or The Wolf of Wall Street, which showed you the back office of Wall Street, like what really goes on. What are the real conversations that bankers and brokers actually have about these products? I mean, that was not really common fodder for content. And I pitched a lot of films like that when I was in Los Angeles. I pitched several films that were like that in nature, where it showed guerrilla warfare in the trenches of the finance and how this could create drama. But everyone I talked to would say, no, it's impossible. You can't dramatize finance. It's impossible. And then all these movies came out dramatizing finance. And I'm like, God damn it. So anyway, we had done that. We did that on this show for years. And I think.
And it's also important to note that like we were in Paris the first few years of our show. And we basically just hung out with each other. Like, we didn't even know our show was super famous. Like, we didn't realize, like, back in 2000 and like there, it was before Twitter had only been invented in like 2008, 2009. Like there was less communications of social network of communicating with random strangers around the world. There would be comments in the YouTube, and that was one indication. But we were making this content, and we were putting it out and didn't realize how much impact. So 2011, 2012. And then in 2013, you had like Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross Ulbricht got arrested, and Charlie Shrem got arrested. And the Senate opened an investigation into Bitcoin, and remember that Senate hearing on Bitcoin, and it was financing terrorism and drug running and all this stuff like that, drug dealing. And then the Financial Times wrote about us. They said the Keiser report on RT, what are they going to do about this? Because they're the ones pushing this thing, Bitcoin, around the world. And I remember that suddenly, I remember looking at Max, so over 2 years at that point of talking about Bitcoin, I was like, oh my God, is this illegal? Like, nobody's told us that we can't talk about this. Like, what is going on? I remember being so scared because Charlie was arrested at JFK, and I was like, oh my God, like, we hadn't been to the US in that whole 2 years. And I was like, oh my God, like, I'm not going back to the US.
Right.
Like, what if we get arrested? We're the ones that are that selling this Bitcoin, like talking about the stories, selling this narrative.
So we're living in a bubble, and we were afraid to go back to the US. But we had to go to the US for some reason.
My mom was sick.
Right. and we land there in New York, and we're there for we drive into the New York City, and people on the street are saying Max and Stacy, waving at us, yelling at us. Some taxi drivers screeched to a halt.
Like dozens of them. People, we had no idea. People were like, Max Keiser.
It was like
and we were
super
like,
famous.
wow.
I had
Like,
no idea.
we literally had no, that was in 2014. And we had no idea. Like, we were like, how do they, I remember being
Where
like,
was
how
the
do they know?
distribution coming from? So where did the exposure come from? Like where were they watching it?
RT. It was on local cable news in New York City.
On YouTube.
Oh, okay.
On YouTube. Plus, we were doing other international
But
outlets.
it was on local cable news as well. So it was on the television. If you turned on your television, it was there.
Yeah, like channel 500 or something.
And but people, you know, in the US, people have like 1,000 channels. And so they're skimming through it. And most of it, if you jump through it, it's mostly commercials wherever you land. But RT didn't have commercials so much. So
Yeah.
there's
What was that like? You guys need to give me some tips because, you know, quite a few Bitcoiners follow me, and this is going to be the inaugural episode. So I was in Bedford the other week.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I mean, Pete McCormick, who knew like he would have the second career as a football club manager or owner, and they've done so well.
He's doing an excellent job there, and also
Amazing.
buying a couple of local businesses. I popped into the coffee shop, and that was quite delicious, actually. Yeah, really good coffee. And then we had drinks at his bar later on, which is a nice looking place, actually. He's doing really, really well. But I was just enjoying the anonymity, and I'd gone there with James and Natalie and Paula,
Yep.
and we sort of split off because they were speakers and I wasn't, but I was just sort of just enjoying the scene without anybody knowing who I was, and I just
Now
realized,
they're gonna
oh God,
know.
this is going to be the last time I'm going to be able to do this. And I just sat outside the the corn exchange and just enjoyed a little bit of the sunshine and just sat around. It was really cool, actually. Nobody really knowing who I was. And then it dawned on me this is going to be the last time. So how do I handle all of this? Please give me some tips because I'm not sure how to handle it. I'm just sort of going into it head
Well,
first.
you're a nice guy. So it's Max will talk for hours to anybody. Like anybody shows up and they ask him all these questions. We were just in DC and I was surprised. Like some guy, a couple with their baby were sitting there and I don't know, they looked like politician sorts. Like obviously everybody works in government if you're in DC pretty much. And so they were like, Stacy. And I thought I knew them. I was like, oh, hey, hi. And they were like, you don't know us. I was like, oh, I don't. Because I'm not used to people still remembering Keiser report because it feels like so much of my life is about working for President Bukele in El Salvador now. So it's like, from Keiser report, you changed our lives. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. But I think people are, there's a new wave of, there's a new wave of people coming to Bitcoin for the first time because of the United
Including
States.
me. I'm
Yeah.
new. I'm new.
Well, new to the podcasting space. A lot of podcasters like McCormick have left. We've taken a hiatus, but we're building a new studio and we're going to do some more content soon. But I've noticed like it's a huge shift, right, of what's going on in the Bitcoin podcasting space. For a long time, it was focused so much on all the fork wars and the dramas behind that. Then it became very corporate, and now maybe there's a different wave of.
Peter McCormick, he stopped doing what Bitcoin did, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Natalie Brunell has kind of like emerged as a
She's
leading
killing it.
light
Yep.
Yes.
in the Bitcoin podcasting world, really.
Very
She's getting a lot of great
professional, very
guests.
slick. Yep. She's very sharp.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, we were, the days that we started was so cypherpunk and garage band sort of thing. It was like the Steve Jobs sort of day. It's because nobody knew anything. I mean, I suppose nobody ever really knows anything is the truth. But at that time, it was even more stark because it was just like this new invention. You know, like when you see those old video clips of when they first started to do the Manhattan Project, for example, and they didn't really understand what uranium was, and they were like holding it, and you think like, oh my God, do you know what you have in your hand? And the same thing there. We didn't really, we knew it was amazing. Obviously, you look back at the content, but it's just like a different thing, right? A different era back then.
I guess
And
it's the same thing as someone holding 1,000 bit. Well, it's not the same thing, but it's the same kind of naivety about holding like, 1,000, 10,000 Bitcoin in your hand without knowing what the future value was really going to be.
yeah.
It's like,
Well, Amir Taki is a good one in that, or anybody who gave away 30,000 on a faucet. But Amir would also do like he would like he didn't have a credit card, so he would ask people to buy him an EasyJet flight, which was like 50 pounds, and he would give you like 200 Bitcoin, and because there was no price to it really, so it was just like that was in like 2010, and he would just like give it to some of our friends we know who knew him, and that sort of thing doesn't exist, right? That door is shut. Very few people could ever be that naive about that Bitcoin has value or not.
Yeah, there's also in the early days there people who got very, very trippy when they went down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin. And because you're one of the first people in history to realize something about separating money from state, and whether you instinctively know this or can articulate it, and that it's a revolution that's happening, and it's hard to express the feelings and the thoughts that are happening in your head, but you can see it in the eyes, and you can see the pinwheel spinning in people's eyes when they talked about Bitcoin, like they were just dropped acid or something. And I remember Charlie Shrem was like this, when we first meet Charlie Shrem, he's somebody who went down that rabbit hole early and understood intimately, explicitly what the future was. And you look in his eyes and he was like pinwheel spinning. He had seen the future. He had seen the future. And he got it. He's one of those people that just got it. And a lot of people did. And when with these people, you had a feeling that they were endowed with supernatural powers that it could kill them or it could empower them. That was, I think, difference between now and then, is that at the early days, this superpower of Bitcoin, for some people, you didn't know how it was going to turn out. And for a lot of people, it turned out badly. The sponsors of, the Craig Wright characters of the world, right? They actually went insane because of the power of this phenomenal, like kryptonite of money. It drove some people absolutely insane.
I remember at the 2012 Bitcoin conference in London, that Amir Taki got up, and maybe it was actually in Prague in 2011, but he gave a speech where it was like he was talking about Bitcoin and that it would allow us to travel through space, like space and time, which was right, but also like actual space into like the solar system and the galaxies. And I remember thinking like, we were quite new to Bitcoin, and I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, who are these people? Because at that point we had only really been to gold conferences where everybody was dressed in suits. And it's kind of getting like that again in Bitcoin, right? That is, everybody's
the
wearing
LinkedIn
suits.
crowd are arriving to Bitcoin. Yeah.
Yeah. But at that time, certainly nobody wore suits. There was one guy who wore a suit first, and that was Barry Silbert. And then, but he was the only one. And then everybody else had hoodies. And, but yeah, Amir Taki was talking about traveling throughout the universe and the galaxies and because of Bitcoin. I was like, where the fuck?
And you couldn't really say he was wrong, you had to kind of think about it. But I think at my latest thought, I'm writing a piece from Bitcoin Magazine about this in terms of, I think that the Bitcoin singularity is when we can telepathically send sats to each other telepathically. So like all of your Bitcoin is mine, all of my Bitcoin is yours. And then we live in the Bitcoin singularity because we can telepathically send sats back and forth. So I think that's the Bitcoin singularity. I think that's where we're going. I think that's where Bitcoin as a monetary instrument breaks down. I think it becomes pure spirit at that point, and we enter the kingdom of spiritual awareness.
And then
I'm not going to call you crazy, Max, because you've been a visionary for far too long for me to doubt you. Guys, this has been a pleasure, a real pleasure. So thank you so much for coming on and supporting my show before it's launched. It was my dream to have you guys as my first episode. It really was. I just want to say thank you again for all the support that you gave me from the very early days, and you continue to support me through my new endeavor with the podcast, and we'll do our best to make it a success, and no thanks to your support. So thank you so much.
And thank you for supporting El Salvador. You're a very good friend of El Salvador, and we appreciate it very much.
I'll do my best. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.